Welcome and thank you for standing by. All participants will be in a listen-only mode during today's conference. I'd like to inform all parties that today's call will be recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'd now like to turn the call over to your host, Ms. Karen Battle. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Fall Virtual Meeting of the National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. We are delighted to have you join us, and we look forward to a productive discussion over the next 2 days. I am Karen Battle, the Chief of the Population Division here at the U.S. Census Bureau, and I'm also the Designated Federal Officer for the National Advisory Committee. In this role, I preside over the Advisory Committee meeting as specified by the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Important information for this meeting, including the conference line and website address, can be found in our Federal Register notice. The proceedings for this meeting, including the agenda, information to access the audio, closed captioning services, and other important details can be found on the NAC meeting webpage. During the 2-day session, only committee members will be permitted to speak, to ask questions, or to make comments of Census Bureau panelists. To the members, we ask that you keep your lines muted during this call until you are acknowledged by the chair. To help facilitate discussion, members' lines will be kept open to allow more efficient discussion, so we must keep background noise to a minimum. Please note that video capability is available for Census Bureau presenters and committee members. As a reminder to my Census Bureau colleagues, I encourage you to enable video during your presentation and the question and answer session. Once your topic has ended, you may turn off your video. I encourage attendees to select the layout button in the upper right to customize your view. At the conclusion of each Census Bureau presentation, the chair of the NAC, James Tucker, with Cherokee Bradley's assistance, who is the vice chair, they will be responsible for facilitating the committee discussion. So members, to join the queue for questions and comments, I ask that you use the virtual raise hand icon found on the lower right corner of the WebEx platform. Once acknowledged by the chair, unmute your line, state your name clearly for the record, and proceed with your question or comment. We have time designated tomorrow at 2:25 p.m. for public comments. At that time, I will read the public comments that we have received in advance of the meeting, and then I will invite and encourage the public to provide verbal comments. Additional instructions will be given to ensure that all parties have an opportunity to have their comments entered into the record. The Federal Register notice located on the NAC website provides information on the process to submit written comments. All meeting materials and public comments are posted on the Census Advisory Committee website for public viewing. At this time, we would like to thank all members of the public, Census leadership, Department of Commerce staff, Congressional staff, and regional staff who are observing today's proceedings. I would also like to personally acknowledge each of our Census Bureau leaders. Ron Jarman, who is the Acting Director of the U.S. Census Bureau, David Zaya, Chief of the Office of Program Performance and Stakeholder Integration, Misty Reed, who is the Acting Associate Director for Communications, Laura Fergione, who is the Chief Administrative Officer, Luis Cato, who is the Chief Information Officer, Ben Page, who is our Chief Financial Officer, Tim Olson, who is our Associate Director for Field Operations, Nick Orsini, who is the Associate Director for Economic Programs, Al Fontenot Jr., who is the Associate Director for Decennial Census Programs, Victoria Velkoff, who is the Associate Director for Demographic Programs, and John Aboud, who is the Associate Director for Research and Methodology and the Chief Scientist. So James, Cherokee, and I will share in facilitating your deliberations today and tomorrow. And between the three of us, we will do our very best to keep the discussion moving, make sure that we hear from folks who have comments, and also work our best to stay on schedule. Our meeting agenda reflects a broad range of topics, and we developed the agenda in response to the Census Bureau's need to share and introduce research and program developments requiring your attention. The agenda also includes topics that the NAC recommended on critical program areas and research. Most topics are divided into three parts. We start with census presentations, followed by discussant presentations, and then we're following that with committee discussion. So first on today's agenda, our committee chair, James Tucker, will share remarks and introduce the NAC vice chair and other committee members. Following James, Ron Jarman will provide executive remarks. Then we have Kendall Johnson, Cale Bauer, and Jen Shopcorn, who will present a recap of 2020 Census Integrated Communications, followed by discussant John Sandoval and committee discussion. We will then pause for a 10-minute break. After that, Nicholas Jones, Roberto Ramirez, and Eric Jensen will present on racial and ethnic diversity in the United States, and they will provide highlights of what we know so far from the 2020 census. And that will be followed by discussant Tycoon Lee and committee discussion. Once we conclude that topic, Jason Devine and Cynthia Hollingsworth will present a status update on 2020 census data products and stakeholder engagement plans, followed by Nicholas Jones, who will present proposed 2020 census data products for detailed racial and ethnic groups. Both of the Census Bureau presentations during this segment will be followed by discussant Thomas Syons and committee discussion. Afterwards, we will pause for another 10-minute break. At that time, we will end the public proceedings for the day. The NAC members will congregate amongst themselves to discuss and formulate recommendations. James Tucker and Cherokee Bradley will lead the NAC discussion and formulation of recommendations. And then we will all reconvene tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for Day 2 of the NAC. As a reminder to the public, during the question and answer sessions today, only committee members will be permitted to ask questions or to make comments. So now, please welcome James Tucker, who will bring the chair's remarks and introduce the vice chair and other NAC members.
Thanks so much, Karen. Good morning. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Jarman, Karen, of course, Antonio Ellis, and the staff in the Advisory Committee branch for all their efforts to coordinate the responses to the NAC's recommendations from the spring meetings and to prepare for our fall meeting. Needless to say, we had a very long list of recommendations in the spring, and we really appreciate the detailed responses that we got back to those. As we get started, I want to note one of the NAC's recommendations from our spring meeting was to add a topic that's not on today's agenda. It's updating the 1997 OMB race and ethnicity standards, including adding a Middle Eastern, North African, or MENA category, and to adopt standards for self-identification of sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI. We understand that the Bureau remains committed to further discussions with the NAC on this important topic, and I just want to place a placeholder here that we look forward to seeing on those topics on the agenda for a future meeting, potentially in spring 2022, if at all possible. We do have a very robust set of topics on the agenda, as Karen has outlined, that we will be covering today and tomorrow. I want to begin by thanking the NAC members and Vice Chair Cherokee Bradley, who work closely with the Bureau's subject matter experts to prepare for our discussion of those topics. One of the key topics we will be addressing today is the Bureau's decision not to release the one-year 2020 American Community Survey estimates due to data collection issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Bureau should be applauded for its transparency about how it made that difficult decision. In particular, the Bureau released a report last week that explained the challenges it faced last year in modifying the data collection procedures in response to the pandemic and the resulting impact that had on the data products. The report is written in plain English that makes it very easy to understand what happened. I encourage everyone to read it. The NAC looks forward to working with the Bureau on addressing the best approach to address barriers to data collection for not only the ACS, but also its other surveys, such as the unprecedented challenges the Bureau has faced in the last 18 months. We also will continue our ongoing discussion of the Disclosure Avoidance System, or DAS, and application of differential privacy to other 2020 census data products, including the Demographic and Housing Characteristic, or DHC file. The NAC applauds the Bureau for its consultations with stakeholders in the public and for its ongoing efforts to address concerns about the impact of the Disclosure Avoidance System on particular population groups. As I have said before, the development and application of differential privacy through the DAS is a remarkable technical achievement. Our continuing concern is to make sure that in our work with the Census Bureau, that application of privacy protections to data products will leave no population group behind. And again, we believe the Census Bureau is equally committed to that goal. I fully expect that we're going to have a very fulsome conversation on these and the other related concerns and topics today. One logistical issue I just want to flag for the NAC members: we will finalize our recommendations in open session beginning largely tomorrow. But if you have a new recommendation, please email it to Cherokee and to me so that we can add it to our working draft, and we will be going through and editing those and revising them in our separate breakouts. In closing, I want to reiterate the appreciation that all of the NAC members and stakeholders have for the Census Bureau's ongoing efforts to engage with us on these and the other topics. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karen. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. And now we will hear from Ron Jarman.
So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fall meeting. And since we couldn't join in Suitland, I thought I'd bring a little Suitland to everybody else here. So I think that's my office up there somewhere. So I'm looking very much forward to the next 2 days of conversations and learning more from your recommendations. Before we get started, I just want to give some agency updates. First, I'd like to highlight that we're currently reviewing candidates' nominations for new members to the NAC, and that the National Urban League's term has expired. Also, if you aren't following this already, the Senate is supposed to be taking up today the nomination of Rob Santos to be the next Census Director. So I'm looking forward to having only one hat to wear instead of the 3 that I'm currently wearing. So looking forward to updates on that over the course of the day. In addition, Jeff Baylor, who is the director of our New York regional office, has been selected as our new director of the Census Bureau's National Processing Center in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Jeff will begin serving that role later this month. And so we look forward to having Jeff in this new role. Michael Thiem, who you may recall was in the decennial directorate during the 2020 census, has moved over to work with me to coordinate a number of enterprise-wide initiatives. And so looking forward to having Mike's expertise and experience in that. But on a sadder note, I want to pass on the news that Jim Treat, our longtime friend and colleague, passed away in early October from an illness. And so we're all missing Jim, both as a person, but as a very valued colleague, and just wanted to share that news with you all. So just moving on to other updates. So though we've released the apportionment counts and redistricting data, the first 2 waves of 2020 census results, there are many more data yet to come out from the 2020 census. Upcoming data products will include the first results on topics not covered in the apportionment and redistricting data, such as sex, relationship, and household type. The data will also provide detail on topics that the redistricting data only touched on, such as age, race, and vacancy status. The most recent 2020 census results that we just released were the pop counts for the island areas. So if you didn't see that, so the The population of American Samoa was 49,710, a decrease of 10.5% from 2010. The Northern Mariana Islands population was 47,329. That represented a decrease of 12.2% relative to 2010. Guam's population was 153,836, and that was a 3.5% decrease from 2010. And the U.S. Virgin Islands population was 87,146, an 18.1% decrease from 2010. We're still determining the release schedule for the detailed demographic and housing characteristic file, or the DHC. The 2020 detailed DHC will provide pop counts as well as demographic and housing characteristics for detailed racial and ethnic groups and American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and village groups. As we update and finalize our plans, we'll continue to keep the public informed through our website. Part of the 2020 Census Data Product Plan include implementing our new disclosure avoidance system, as James alluded to, based on differential privacy. And that helps us balance the accuracy of our statistics while also providing confidentiality to the individuals represented in the data. The more statistics we produce and the more granular detail we provide, the more the individuals are at risk of being identified in the data. So this week, we released a new handbook on disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census. And this handbook, the DAS is described in the context of the 2020 census redistricting data summary file, because those are the first 2020 census data released that use the new confidentiality procedures. The apportionment counts were released earlier in April, and they were not subject to these new confidentiality procedures, and were actually the as-enumerated pop counts for each state. I want to just take a moment to thank all of the people, both inside and outside the Census Bureau, who participated in the preparation of this handbook that I think will be a great value to our data users. This winter, we also aim to release some demonstration data that apply potential disclosure avoidance system settings to the 2010 census data to produce published statistics that are similar to the proposed 2020 DHC tables. The demonstration data will help enable the public to assess the accuracy and privacy protection of the DHC tables. Kind of switching gears a little bit, earlier this year, as you may know, President Biden announced a federal agenda to advance equity for everyone living in the country, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. And as an agency, the Census Bureau is committed to producing data that depicts an accurate portrait of America, including its underserved communities. And we've launched a new Data for Equity webpage on census.gov, where you can browse tools for racial, ethnic, and gender outcomes, business and employment, and assessing disparate impacts. We provide a wealth of data by key demographic variables such as race, ethnicity, sex, disability, income, and veteran status to help measure equity. We supply data tools to help the public and policymakers understand the issues surrounding inequities and enable them to propose effective evidence-based solutions. And among other uses, Census Bureau can provide metrics to show how the assistance programs impact their targeted audiences. A major part of our mission is to educate the public, policymakers, and stakeholders on the data that we have available and how to use them. And we want to empower data users with understandable, accurate, and timely information. We do this through a variety of programs where we hope to empower data users with understandable, accurate, and timely information. We provide training and assistance to foster two-way communication on data usability, data user needs, and operational issues using our data dissemination specialists, our state data center program, and the Census Information Center. The Census Bureau has a long history of conducting research to improve questions on data on race and ethnicity. Since the first census in 1790, the census has collected information on race and ethnicity. And the census form has reflected changes in society and shifts that have occurred in the way the Census Bureau classifies race and ethnicity. Since the 1970s, we've conducted content tests to research and improve the design and function of different questions, including the questions on race and ethnicity. And today, the Census Bureau collects race and ethnicity data that follow the U.S. Office of Management and Budget guidelines. And these data are based on self-identification. Another key aspect of data equity is ensuring that our data is is accurate reflection of America. And as a statistical agency, we continuously work to prove how we measure diversity of the public. This work includes researching strategies to improve respondent understanding of the questions we ask, discussing our research and findings with stakeholder groups, and working within the federal statistical system to improve how we measure demographic characteristics. Importantly, the Census Bureau can assist federal agencies and others in equitably distributing resources and identifying underserved communities, including rural places, and we're proud to provide data that can be used by policymakers and the public to advance equity for everyone. A recent example of this is our annual business survey, and we provide information on selected economic and demographic characteristics for businesses and business owners by sex, ethnicity, race, and veteran status. We are continuously learning and growing to transform how we do our jobs better and to meet the needs of the public. The input we receive from our many partners, such as you and other stakeholders, is critical to helping us improve our mission. Another update I just want to get you up to speed on is we've recently, and we've discussed this in this committee before, is national partnerships is a way to help out beyond the 2020 census. So with the overarching goal of maintaining those important relationships that we built through the 2020 census campaign into the future, I'm pleased to announce that we've launched a new Census Bureau office called the Office of Strategic Alliances. This office will focus on enterprise partnership efforts, starting with helping the Economic Directorate with their upcoming economic census in 2022, as well as the decennial census and 2020 dissemination efforts. The office will be led by Maria Malagon, who you've, I think, seen for this committee before. She's serving as the chief and has been at the Census Bureau for almost 2 decades. Joining Maria is Anna Owens, and she's been at the Census for over 15 years and heavily involved in the 2020 partnership efforts. Maria and Anna are leading what is currently a very small staff with extensive experience working in national partnerships, and we thank you for your continued support as we leverage these partnerships for other enterprise-wide efforts. So finally, let me just give a few updates. So in fiscal year 22, the Census Bureau will have completed the major operations for the 2020 census and will be releasing, fulfilling its constitutional legal mandates. We continue releasing data from the census and measuring its quality and evaluating operations and ramping down the infrastructure built for the peak of operations. We'll also be beginning planning for the 2030 census, conducting key research and testing on a path to 2030 census design, transitioning robust program management investments, and maintaining and refining critical information technology investments that were made for the 2020 census. More broadly, we've begun a multi-year process of transforming the Census Bureau's organization and operations from a 20th century survey-centric model to a 21st century data-centric model that blends survey data with administrative and other source data, largely from digital sources, to improve our products across the full range, both household and business data products. This will not only benefit the 2030 census, but our monthly, quarterly, and annual surveys as well. The FY22 request maintains investments in data management infrastructure, survey sample frames, user-centric dissemination systems, and enhanced administrative records research, while turning our focus to programmatic improvements designed to make data collection and dissemination more efficient and provide more timely economic data to our users. Initiatives proposed for 22 would provide more timely inputs for GDP and other principal economic indicators, continue efforts to enhance data dissemination and communications, and apply technological solutions to data collection challenges that we've seen enhanced recently during the pandemic. And this would be across the board of both our household and business surveys. In FY22, we'll build on the pulse surveys conducted in response to the COVID-19 crisis to expand our ability to gauge economic and societal impacts in close to real time of other such events in the future. We'll advance measures of, I think I'll skip these last parts. So just let me conclude that we're happy to discuss any of these things farther, but look forward to the discussions over the next 2 days. And I guess I'll turn it back over to Karen now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ron. And so, James, at this time, if you or the committee have questions for Ron, you may proceed to discuss those now.
Okay, thanks so much, Karen. And I'll kick it off with the first question to Ron. While folks indicate in the chat again or that they would like questions, please make sure you raise your hand and we will put you in the queue. I just want to tell you that we're really, really happy to hear that the Census Bureau is evergreening the National Partnership Program, because we always thought that it was such a great program for the 2020 census, the work that went into having 18 to 24 months of really strong partnerships. And we really look forward to seeing that applied to really all of the census survey and data collection programs. We're particularly pleased to hear that it's going to be Maria, because obviously we've worked with her in the past. And I guess one of the things I just want to tee up, and I'm hoping I'm not going to steal Karthik's thunder, because I think he's going to talk about this a little bit more in his discussant presentation. There has been a parallel effort by some of the groups on the outside to actually focus on community-based organizations and working with businesses, specifically focusing on the American Community Survey. And I guess I'm just wondering, how do you see that plugging into the schedule of what Maria will be taking up, and in what ways do you think that we'll be able to really make ACS much stronger in terms of the partnership program?
So I think one of the key sort of constituent groups that we want to reach out to in this sort of evergreen partnership program is the business community. So businesses are sort of unique in that they are both heavy users of our data, especially ACS data, but they also provide data. And I think if we are going to sort of fulfill our mission of measuring the people and the economy of our country in closer to real time at a lower level of granularity, a partnership type relationship is going to have to be established with the business community. So this is really important, and we've already started some of this work. You all don't see it as much in the NAC, but some of it's been discussed in other advisory committees like the CSAC and FESAC, but where we're getting much more granular, more timely data from businesses than we do from our traditional business surveys. But also businesses are key data users, and so right now the Census Bureau kind of approaches businesses wearing two hats. So we work with them as potential advocates for things like the census. We work with them as data users when they have questions about ACS or other data programs, and then we're out there asking them to fill out surveys. And I think what we're trying to establish is that there's much more of a collaborative relationship, I think, between Census and the other statistical agencies and the business community. And so we're really hoping that that's one of the outcomes of our Evergreen Partnership Program, is that we're in constant contact about the whole suite of issues that the Census Bureau has with the business community. So we're looking very much forward to that and hoping that it bears fruit in a number of domains. So.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And I just want to flag that we were especially pleased to see the business survey discussion that we're going to have tomorrow. I know I actually learned a lot both from the Bureau and from Chalene in working with her on that, and we really look forward to that. We do have one question in the queue so far, so Karthik, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So just following up on that, this is exciting to see in terms of the Evergreen Partnership plans. Could you speak a little on how this may be structured in terms of national level relationships as opposed to state and local? Clearly, there'll be resource implications to do both, but I think it's going to be so important as we head to 2030 for the Census Bureau not to be a stranger in these states. And especially even before that, one of the things that we're going to be talking about with the ACS is ACS response rates and how can we get those up. So in addition to the business community, so many lower income communities and communities of color, they're going to be important stakeholders to help increase awareness and also hopefully response rates.
So I don't know if I have too much to say on that right now. Obviously, we've just stood this up, and compared to the scale of the operation that we have during the census, this is orders of magnitude smaller. And so I think, to some degree, we know that we have to make progress on all of these levels, and there will probably be efforts made on all of those levels. But we'll be looking, sort of for key partners who are willing to, throw their weight behind some of these things as well. And so, looking for those opportunities where we have a energized partner to work with. But obviously, over the decade, we hope to sort of grow this. Obviously, it'll get grown a lot as we approach the end of the decade. But I think as we start to show the value of this more of a collaborative relationship with the business community and other stakeholders, I think that we'll be able to, start to make a case that this is something that needs, more funding and that sort of thing. So looking forward to starting to show some of the value added from this. Again, across our full range of data products, this is something where, the decennials benefited greatly from these efforts, but our other programs, including the ACS, have not had the kind of benefits. And we're hoping to sort of see that spread more evenly across the different programs that the Census Bureau has.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking, currently we don't have anyone else in the queue. We will give you one last chance to raise your hand. In the meantime, Ron, I guess I'm wondering, do you have a preliminary idea of what the timeline will be for the DHC rollout, especially with respect to the application of differential privacy and consultation with stakeholders?
So I don't think we have a lot of details, and I'm looking at Al up there in the corner of my screen. But, again, this is something where there's a lot of review and stuff going on. And so, I think right now we're not quite at a point where we can sort of say definitively what the timing would be. But, progress is being made, and we'll keep everybody up to date as we sort of cross threshold milestones of where we think we can be more specific about the timing.
Okay, thanks so much. And I see Tom Sands has his hand up. So, Tom, please.
Hi, Ron. I had two sort of unrelated questions. The first is I wonder if you could tell us more about where you are in vetting new NAC members and really the timing for when we can expect to sort of know how we will be fully membered out, right. Number one. And then second, and this clearly relates, although I understand it's a much lean operation that relates to the evergreening of the partnership program. I'm wondering if at some point we get some sense of how many of the temporary staff hired for the decennial effort ended up more permanently with the Bureau. I assume it's a small number, but I'm interested in sort of knowing what the scope of that is, who it was, et cetera, if that could be given.
So on the on that last question, we'll have to see what we can do. So sorry, what was the first question? You got me thinking about data.
The first question was about NAC numbers.
How we could go mine our HR data to actually understand that last fact, which would be fascinating, actually. I don't think we've ever done that before. That's a good suggestion.
Yeah. So the first question, Ron, was about NAC members.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we have dossiers of a number of people. We hope to be fully membered out for the spring meeting. I think folks are working right now to schedule a review panel and stuff like that. So we hope to have that, moving forward. Obviously, we've got the holidays and stuff coming up, but the plan is to have this all done for the spring meeting.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Tom and Ron. And I just to build on that, I think all of us understand the importance of making sure that we, to maintain the continuity of experienced members of the NAC, to make sure that we continue to have these roll-ons of new members, so that we don't end up in a situation where we have too many members rolling off at the same time and losing that experience.
Absolutely. We share that goal.
I don't see any more hands raised, so we may actually be in a position that we're going to pick up about 10 minutes of time as we head into the first presentation. So I believe, Ron, unless you have any other further comments, we'll turn it back to Karen.
Great.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So now let's get started with our first presentation. So please welcome Kendall Johnson, Cale Bauer, and Jen Shapcorn, who will present a recap of 2020 Census Integrated Communications, followed by discussant John Sandoval and committee discussion.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, it's just nice to be able to talk to you again. It feels like it's been a long time. We're going to give you a quick recap of what happened during the ICC, the Integrated Communications Campaign. But first, I just want to say that each census brings with it a curveball or three. In 2000, the issue was around the use of sampling. In 2010, it was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And in 2020, the issues were compounded by disinformation, politics, civil unrest, and a pandemic. Yet we, the Census Bureau, and all of our partners, including you, were able to overcome and succeed. We not only believed in the mission, but we also carried it out. So thank you for all of your insights, your patience, your guidance, and your advice. So let's start with a short video that provides some of the campaign highlights before we get into actual accomplishments.
In America, we all count, no matter where we call home, how we worship, or who we love. And the 2020 census is how that great promise is kept. Because this is the count that informs where hundreds of billions in funding will go each year for things like education, healthcare, and programs that touch us all. A good future. Start here. Learn more at 2020census.gov. What is the 2020 census? The census counts everyone living in the country. And it records everyone who lives at your address on April 1st. The data can be used to inform important funding decisions that affect your community. Check your future. Start here. Visit 2020census.gov.
There will be parties against this. There will be parades, and sporting events, and concerts to help our communities when they come back together. Go to 2020census.gov and respond today to make America's tomorrow brighter.
Make your family count. Oh, oh, oh. Hey, y'all. We're Defense Census here. So look, nothing about us should ever be decided without us.
Education has issues that need to be fixed. Those issues can be fixed without doubt. Every kid deserves a high-quality education, and we won't get that if we're not all counted. I want to shape the future of the next generation, and it starts with the census.
Hola, ¿sabes qué hacer?
要帮他们排成的透明。哦，那是真的，これはパーティーで、ラッシャルチョロタオラショロジナ。
これで業務年代や事業が決まる。
Okay, so
Kendall, this is Shauna. Can you hear us?
Yes, yes. All right. So here we are. Here are a few. We're going to start with a few of the campaign highlights. This research, was very research-based. We talked about that. And this research included an expanded census barriers, attitudes, and motivators study, or CBAMS as we affectionately call it, robust predictive modeling, track-level audience segmentation, daily track-level self-response modeling, and robust creative testing across 30 individual audiences. It included awareness-based tracking surveys, social listening analysis, led to recommendations for Census Week surge. That Census Week surge lifted self-response levels above predictive model benchmarks for the first time. The daily response rate analysis across multiple levels of geography, languages, and audiences during response informed in-campaign placement of paid media and earned media, as well as stakeholder and partner outreach and engagement. The creative pivot in March 2020 to address the changing realities due to COVID-19 and 2020 census operational changes and timelines. It included integrated focus pushed into selected local geographies, as well as the expansion and reweighting of media outlets and channels and expansion to 47 languages supported by the ICC. Next slide. So for field recruitment, the use of targeted digital advertising was instrumental in our ability to attract and hire a diverse workforce. As you can see on the slide, we had over 621 unique assets that were developed for recruitment. The digital ads delivered over 283.2 million impressions, and those digital impressions resulted in over 5.1 million clicks to the website and 1.6 million clicks to apply. Next slide. The number of focus groups for CBAMS, creative platform tagline, and creative reviews were numerous than those conducted for the previous two censuses. We held 140 focus groups, 1,600 online sessions, and 78 community representative reviews with a broad range of audiences to test the creative platform and advertisements prior to moving into production and launching the campaign. Creative production for all audiences overlapped, testing our ability to be in multiple places at one time. The number of creative assets produced far outnumber those produced in the past two censuses combined. We completed 165 production and photography shoots for television and video, radio, print, out-of-home, and digital advertisements, including virtual productions for advertisements developed to address the COVID-19 pandemic. We created over 3,500 creative assets for paid placement, and a total of 7,903 creative assets developed in 45 languages for television, video, radio, print, out-of-home, and digital, inclusive of assets for paid advertising, non-paid placements like public service announcements, recruitment advertising, and statistics in schools. The integrated teams we had for creative and media review included representatives from communications, decennial, field division, and Department of Commerce. And this integrated team not only allowed insight and input from across the Bureau, they also fostered collaboration and an understanding in the process necessary to achieve buy-in and stakedness for the campaign, all of which will benefit 2030 plans. Next slide. Paid media was placed with 9,688 media outlets, and it is estimated to have reached over 99% of the population across all phases of the campaign, resulting in over 28.68 billion digital impressions. The media buy was shared on our website and updated each time additional buys were made. So the question I want to know is how many of you saw our messages? I'm hoping that all of you saw our messages. I don't know about you, but when they first came out, I was very excited. But by May, I was tired of them. I'm not sure how you felt, but the bottom line is that meant that we were doing our job. Next slide. A common misconception is that the communications contractor did all the work. Well, that's not true. Census staff were right there in the trenches working alongside the contractor. In support of the 2020 census, the media team produced over 50 stories, blogs, and articles. 54 media briefings, and 31 radio and satellite media tours that garnered hundreds of interviews, over 185 media releases, and over 100 products. While Team Y&R provided a good bit of assistance, PIO, our Public Information Office, provided a significant amount of support for the campaign, external and internal communications, day-to-day engagement with the media, media monitoring, and response. And that was on top of the regular work that they had to do to support everything else that Census does. Overall, social media growth was impressive, jumping from 256,000, well, roughly 257,000 to 448,000 across channels for overall growth in followers of 74%. In fiscal year 20, the total number of video views grew to 343.7 million. This is up from 2.7 million total views in FY19. The number of subscribers to our channel increased by 31,300 during this time. Next slide. In support of the 2020 census, the partnership program we developed a diverse national partnership program with the eventual goal of supporting the entire enterprise, resulting in commitments from over 1,000 major corporations, nonprofits, and governmental organizations, including over 150 partnership commitments from leading technology and social media firms. More than 150 national, digital, and state Department of Education partners were recruited and activated to encourage and increase use of the 2020 census materials and to promote completion of the 2020 census. We developed over 250 print and digital materials in 15 languages. More than 45 million copies were printed and distributed to partners and partnership specialists for use in their outreach efforts. And we produced 30-plus unique promotional items with 122 total variations for a total of 12.6 million pieces that were also distributed to partners and partnership specialists for use in their outreach efforts. All this was accomplished despite a shift in strategy midstream and pivoting to adjust constraints caused by the pandemic. This team just went with the flow and kept producing, finding innovative ways to progress despite the lack of in-person events. Next slide. Statistics in schools is an educational component for school-aged children and has been a part of the census for many decades. However, 2020 was the most robust effort ever. Between October 1, 2019 and September 30th, 2020, the SIS website logged over 1.5 million visits and 366,000 worksheet downloads. Informational materials about the SIS program and the 2020 census, including large wall maps for the classroom, were mailed to more than over 118,000 schools across the country. Over 300 new materials were created for the 2020 Census SIS program, including 67 classroom worksheets, each with an accompanying teacher's guide, 10 wall maps for the classroom, a take-home flyer in 14 languages, and 12 videos. Next slide, please. The 2020 Census.gov website was successfully launched. Web traffic on Census.gov and 2020 Census.gov average visits per month went from 4.4 million in FY19 to more than 21 million in FY20. Web traffic overall went from more than 53 million in 2019 to over 189 million in 2020. FY20 saw a 41.4% increase in API keys requested in FY 2020. The success of the website had a direct impact on the self-response rate for the census and was critical in helping the Bureau reach its goal of 66.6% self-response. Next slide. Campaign monitoring optimization. While we fielded the 2020 tracking survey, which had over 127,000 interviews through the phone and by phone and online, it provided feedback on how the public perceived the census and census-related issues like COVID-19. I won't talk more about that because Cale Bauer is going to cover a little bit more about this topic just shortly. Next slide. So here's a list of some of the many awards we have received so far. But before I finish, I just want to touch on a couple of other additional AdCom accomplishments. We spearheaded a 2020 Census partnership initiative that resulted in nearly every congressional office becoming a 2020 Census partner. We coordinated email marketing and promotional efforts through weekly updates, reaching 2,600 chiefs of staff, communications directors, and Hill press secretaries on a weekly basis. We responded to nearly 1,000 congressional inquiries and hundreds of letters. We managed relationships with more than 14,000 state and local officials through regular calls and biweekly email updates. We launched America Counts, an effective storytelling tool about census data and programs. The site hit the 1 million visit milestone in August of 2020 and became the 4th visited site on census.gov in December 2020. The total number of email subscribers drastically increased 96.5% from fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 20, with 1.66 million current subscribers. Since the start of FY20, the team sent 5,889 unique email marketing newsletters with total messages sent standing at over 258 million, and a delivery rate of 97.4%, open rate of 12.7%, and a 1.8% click rate. Oh yeah, and again, the campaign won approximately 45 awards to date. Now I'm going to pass this over to Kale Bauer, who will now discuss campaign optimization. Kale?
Hi, thank you, Kendall. As Kendall indicated, we had an exciting campaign optimization phase of the 2020 census. So when you think about campaign optimization, you really want to think about it as the intersection of our campaign research and planning, the campaign execution, and then the data that was generated for the campaign. So our response rate, the media data, what was happening around the world at the time, and what operational changes that we encountered. Now, as a direct result of tracking more than 200 issues, implementing over 120 discrete campaign interventions, we guided the placement of over $200 million in paid advertising over the baseline plan, which ended up being over 40% of the total media spend. How did we get there? Well, we worked daily. We had daily response rate analysis across 9 levels of geography, 12 languages, 9 segments, and 20-plus audience groups. Next slide, please. So we used all that data that we collected and analyzed daily to optimize primarily our digital creatives, because that's where we had the most flexibility. We ran over 2,500 digital creatives in the awareness phase and 8,000 in motivation. This allowed our media teams to work within those platforms to optimize that creative to serve each of our audiences. Now, during the campaign, there were events we were planning for, and then the events that occurred while we were in market that we weren't planning for, but still required updated creative. So in order to develop that creative, we used historical data, media behavior insights, and information on the current environment. So let's talk through a couple of these events. Next slide, please. We started with our Census Day Media Blitz, and it was a high-impact takeover of popular websites alongside our digital media creative. For these opportunities, we only had that one shot to capture audiences. So we used a data-driven approach to determine which creative ran in these large-scale media opportunities. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. Up one, please. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we worked to create updated assets to run across channels. And I'm proud to say we were one of the fastest in market to pivot that creative. We took what was already performing well and updated that to the current situation that most Americans found themselves in. So concentrating more on being able to complete the census at home, how audiences like college students should complete the census, and updating the imagery that you saw to people wearing masks and social distancing. Next slide. We learned that our short, focused ads were working best with our audiences. And our COVID ads ended up having higher interaction times than our benchmarks. slide, please. As you know, Update Leave was delayed due to the pandemic. So we realized we needed to adapt the creative in those areas where forms delivery was delayed. We adjusted the ads that ran those new ads exclusively in the Update Leave area. This resulted in conversion rates increasing 52% during the first week of when the fourth mailing ads ran compared to the previous week. We took that success and rolled it into a video delivered to Update Leave areas, asking people to be on the lookout for their forms, asking them to keep that in mind. They're still coming. They will still be there. This video had a through play 25% higher than average 30-second videos at the time. Next slide, please. We also executed targeted campaigns for each region over the period of July 13th to August 2nd. We took a week to really concentrate on each of the 6 regions. And in this time, the national response rate grew by 0.9 percentage points. Next slide, please. Now, our original plans did not have a large non-response follow-up phase. However, as the data collection was extended, we also extended our campaign. We deployed expanded motivation and reminder creative for all audiences. We created an Answer the Call video for our website and YouTube channel, and we engaged additional educational partners with our SIS material. Next slide. And as part of our earned, shared, and owned activities, we entered 56 hyper-local markets, so very small targeted areas. We developed 145 city profiles. We delivered over 36 million visits to 2020census.gov, conducted 141 TV and radio interviews in August and September in low response areas, and then an additional 100 in mid-September in the bottom 10 self-response states. All of these efforts and the way we were able to look at the data on a daily basis, adapt our messaging and our interactions with the public helped to contribute to that national self-response rate. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jen to talk about trust and safety.
Thanks, Carol. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, great. That was a really fun trip down memory lane. I haven't actually looked at those ads for a long time, and I've got a big goofy grin on my face. I think, one thing we saw clearly from what Kendall went through and Kay went through is we had an incredible volume of content circulating out there during the 2020 census, and we were able to react very quickly and nimbly to circumstances with new content. And states and partners and stakeholders generated their own content that complemented that really, really well. When you looked at that whole landscape out there, however, unfortunately and inevitably, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation circulating, and it was our trust and safety team that detected and responded to that, so our campaign could occupy as much of that landscape as possible. And what we really wanted was for the public to have factual, reliable information. It's important to note that in addition to our monitoring and reactive response to that misinformation and disinformation, we did, as we were doing our planning, work really hard to anticipate misinformation and disinformation that would be out there and release proactive content on a variety of channels. And a lot of that you saw in the communications campaign, the partnership materials. We had that content on our website. We even had chatbot and voice assistant content, and especially on our rumors page that we created as part of our trust and safety effort. I'm going to focus on our reactive work today, but I didn't want to let that go unmentioned. Next slide, please. Thanks. Detecting misinformation and disinformation is not only about monitoring social media. That's certainly a really important piece. But our monitoring operation also ingested streams of information from phone lines, email inboxes. We set up a rumors at census.gov inbox so people could contact us directly. It was important for us to also create pathways so people could report directly what they were hearing on the ground in conversations and also traditional media. We found it was especially important to create those reporting pathways for our employees, particularly those out in the field, and our partners and stakeholders. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And the public. We empowered the public to identify and report misinformation and disinformation to us. They could do that a couple ways. They could reach out to us on social media. We had an active social care program going. I mentioned the email inbox we set up where they could report things that they thought were inaccurate. And then we also had our call center, and importantly, we had a huge partner network where folks could talk to their trusted voices if they felt like they were seeing something out there that wasn't correct. Monitoring and detection is a really key point there, but it has to be paired with quickly constructed and disseminated corrective messaging to help combat the spread of misinformation and disinformation. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Next slide, please. Thanks. You've heard a lot about national partnerships. We're really excited to keep that work going between now and 2030 with the Office of Strategic Alliances that Ron talked about earlier. We had a bunch of partnerships in the context of trust and safety while we were working on this effort. And so what I'm going to talk about today is that Trust and Safety Partner Network. There is some overlap with our national partnerships, but I do want to be clear about what I'm mentioning in this context. Our Trust and Safety Partners, however, like our national partners, did help us reach a broader audience and bolstered our ability to detect and take action against misinformation and disinformation. And what you see on the slide here are the key segments of our Trust and Safety Partner Network. They were really key in helping us detect misinformation and disinformation. We had our own capabilities, but groups like civil society groups had their own monitoring efforts. Some of that was digital. Some of it was phone lines and hotlines they had stood up for the effort. And then a lot of it was actually just grassroots work that they were doing where they would hear things on the ground and pass that to us. And we had those process streams put in place pretty early. And that would also help us get ahead of things before they hit social media and allow us to jump on them when we saw them there. Other federal agencies were really key in helping provide insights on disinformation campaigns that they were seeing internationally, so we had a heads up as to what to look for before it hit our own monitoring channels. And then tech partners were also tremendously useful in the detection piece of the work. And every single one of these partners helped us correct misinformation and disinformation when it was out there and combat it. Consumer advocates are key in helping to warn the public about frauds and scams. Fact-check organizations are instrumental, trusted voices, even for the other partners, so that when misinformation and disinformation is detected, when they put out that authoritative content, it helps other partners feel comfortable and joining to correct the information. And civil society organizations, again, are just such incredibly authentic sources of information, whether it's in the context of misinformation, disinformation, or otherwise. And they're also key pathways to engage hard-to-count populations. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to run through just 3 quick examples of misinformation and disinformation we saw so you can get a sense of the work that we did, the things that we were seeing, and how we worked against it, and some of the nuances that are out there when it comes to misinformation and disinformation. Some of you may have heard about this before. It started in about September 2019, and we actually saw it on social media and hard copy in community centers. It was a message warning the public that people were knocking on doors, claiming to be census takers from the Department of Home Affairs, and then robbing people. And this was capitalizing on a few things. It was capitalizing on people's lack of knowledge of federal government agency names, and also on people's tendency to warn others of scams and help protect people's safety. And it did that in an attempt to keep the public from participating in the census. There wasn't actually anyone knocking on doors saying they were from Home Affairs Department. But folks didn't realize that. And so community leaders, and even in a couple cases, local police departments and local media outlets, in an effort to do good and warn their local community, spread this message. And again, they're trying to help the public and inadvertently instilling fear that potentially kept people from participating in the census. Our team traced the origin of this item back to South Africa, where it started in advance of their national census, and then it spread to Kenya, then to the UK, and then to the United States. So we did a couple things. We worked directly with the folks who were inadvertently spreading the disinformation, like those local community centers and police departments. And then we also worked with fact-check organizations, traditional media, to get the word out there on those local media outlets, civil society groups, and tech companies to stop the spread, and we published information on it on our website directly contradicting it. Next example, please, or next slide, please. Thanks. At first glance, this might seem like a great motivational tactic to some. Tell people they can't get stimulus check money stemming from the pandemic relief unless they filled out the 2020 census. But its intent was really to harm the Census Bureau's reputation as a vigilant guard of personal information by implying we share census responses with the Treasury. That then instilled fear in people, so they did not respond. This targeted millions of people in financial relief, and actually in about a 2-week period caused the number of reports to our rumors inbox to jump by about 273%, which on another hand was actually really good because it meant that some of that proactive messaging we had developed anticipating people's confusion on points like this, then we saw part of our campaign and our partnership materials, that was working. So one thing we did, in addition to the other tactics you can see here on the slide, was to help those folks who had responded well to the proactive content we had out there, to reinforce that their understanding of that was correct when they were emailing our inbox, reporting it, we replied to them. That was not typically how we handled things coming into our rumors inbox. We actually usually just used it as a one-way stream of reporting to us and worked on a couple of other avenues to slow the spread of this, and we did that pretty dramatically within about 4 days. Next slide, please. Thanks. Lookalike mailers, not a new thing in 2020. A different kind of problem in 2020 with the expansion of social media since 2010. In one case, a fake mailer made its way to an organization that recorded a video with a celebrity. This was not at all nefarious, just innocent misinformation, as the fake mailer the celebrity happened to hold in the video had a QR code on it. You all probably are familiar enough with our official mailings to know that we didn't have QR codes in our mail packages. So we didn't want this video to spread too far and have people see that, excuse me, and think that what they got from us in the mail was not the real item since it lacked a QR code. So we activated a few tactics in response to this. We had already had the official mailings posted on our website, so we pursued a couple avenues to amplify that. And the organization that made this video was actually not part of our official partner list, but what was great is the civil society network that we were partnering with through our trust and safety work was able to put us in contact with them so they could adjust the video. Next slide, please. This is just a quick glance at some of our success metrics. This is a benchmark from August of 2019 through, I think, about the end of the census, if not more current. I'll have to check on that. My apologies. It gives you a sense of the volume of reports we had to our rumors inbox, how valuable a resource our Fighting Rumors page was, how many times we worked with fact-check organizations to get the right information out there, and the success rate with some of our tech partners. Next slide. To complement Kendall's slide on awards, here's some awards our trust and safety team has been recognized with, or in some nominations. We're really appreciative of that recognition and ultimately just really honored to have the opportunity to get factual information out to the public. And this is work we're going to continue to do. Thank you so much.
So that ends our presentation. We are available for any questions should you have any.
Okay, Karen, I think at this time we're going to be going over to John Sandoval as the discussant, and then we will do the questions right after John's presentation. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you.
Good morning, all. Thank you very much. Special appreciation for Kendall, Kale, and Jen. It's my pleasure to provide my discussant comments. And I think I'll probably go back to something that Kendall started out with. If you could advance the next slide, please. It's helpful to consider that from the base plan, version 2.0, listed, over 1,000 creative assets. This plan was addressing a myriad number of mindsets and audience segments across nearly any possible media type you can imagine, doing it across 13 languages, had multiple phases, and it was an election year. So just with that base plan scenario, one can really appreciate just the tremendous challenge faced by the team and the Census Bureau and its partners in 2020. And if you move on to the next slide, I'm reminded of a quote by Woody Allen. So if you want to make God laugh, tell him about your plan. And I think this is something that we can all relate to, either in our personal lives, workplaces, pretty much universal. And really this cannot be more true with the census in 2020. So we think about all the challenges on top of what we expected to be challenges, the global COVID-19 pandemic, lots of activities and decisions by the federal government. We had nationwide protests. There was really an upheaval in the media landscape. The number of creative assets totaled in the end over 3,500. We actually added that additional 34 languages for a total of 47 languages. And we had pauses and prolongations of different phases of the program. So when you think of getting to that goal of 67% in terms of national response rate, really deserves special recognition and celebration. So I think it's something that we should all remember and keep in perspective as we go through this. Next slide, please. So I'll be organizing some of my comments and questions according to some of the different sections that were highlighted, as well as in the end, just posing some additional questions. In terms of field recruitment, we learned of the number of impressions, how many clicks we got to the website, and just doing some very quick math, that would give us a 1.8% click-through rate. So obviously, click-through rates, you need some kind of context to understand whether it's good, whether it's lower, whether it's higher, whether it's surprising. So just taking some data from 2018 from Google Display Network in terms of employment services, they shared the average click-through rate for employment services industry is a 0.59%. So it looks like that was a very good click-through rate. But again, it would be helpful to understand what is exactly the benchmark the Census Bureau used to measure its efforts. What was the goal for that click-through rate? And then also a question on how we actually determine conversions. So was it actually clicking to that next section to start the application? Was it actually completing the application? But having information there to understand what was the actual defined conversion and understanding what that conversion rate was to be able to benchmark that against either the census historical standards or industry background. Also, what role did integrated communication plan play in responding and addressing challenges posed by COVID-19 on the enumerator workforce? So given there was a pause in non-response follow-up, there's a lot of talk about attrition, workforce attrition, or are they going to come back to work in a COVID environment where they have to go out and meet with the people? I know also that recruitment was extended up to the very end. So having some idea of how the integrated communication really was an instrument to make this successful and deal with these waves as they were sweeping over the very important part of the census execution. Next slide, please. As I reviewed Plan 2.0, I was really impressed by just the robust quantitative and qualitative qualification process that the messaging and creative assets went through based on the CBAM's insights and learning. So, again, the Census Bureau had to respond to the new reality, the new communication reality, and how was that approach informed? So, again, you had to remove visuals of large crowds because people weren't convening in large crowds, remove visuals of classroom settings and kids weren't going to school. Lots of changes had to be made to existing creative to make it more relevant and really show that you get where people are at right now. So did this have an impact on creative performance? What was the thought process that went into these ads that were already qualified and then had to be changed? That's not to mention the actual production of new assets. Across the board, production was really halted in many cases. We didn't see our favorite TV shows, our movies. That affected TV productions, commercial productions as well. So just curious how these COVID-19 restrictions affected the census as they went forward and made new assets. Really encouraging and amazing and awesome to see the additional languages, 34 additional languages in creative assets that were developed and qualified compared to the original 13 language set. So did these 47 languages perform well? They prohibitive expensive to produce? Where do we come down on this? And is this something that we want to think about moving forward as incorporating as part of the baseline for the 2030 census? Slide, please. So media and planning and buying, I do not envy those team members. Just tremendous upheaval in the landscape. Large audience media events. We can think of all of our favorite sports events, all of our league events. Award shows were either canceled or postponed. And these shows are still some of the last remaining tentpoles in the media industry where you actually get a lot of people in real time watching and listening and looking. So how did you handle this? What was the net effect? Census Bureau is not alone in that there are lots of brand advertisers. Pretty much anyone who's advertising are doing the same shifts in the landscape. So you find a number of different organizations competing for that same media slots. And how does this affect the plan? How does it affect execution against our goals? Lots of things to contend with. Also, what was the effect on the budget? So really unavoidably, there was a lot of, I imagine, loss of planned media placement. Campaign was extended. So net, did that kind of cancel each other out? Or just really where do the dollars go and how are they used in comparison to what the original plan was? Of course, reaching the entire population of the United States is an amazing and a tough goal to reach. But also curious, how did that break down for frequency? And then how did that break down against our different audience segments? Was the census able to get that message the number of times they wanted to in front of those exact audience segments? And really impressive operation by earned and owned media. So curious as to know what that relative performance was between paid media. What official objective? Often earned and owned media can work harder than paid media, and it's not exactly a free lunch, but it's different than paying for every eyeball that you see. And then lastly on this section, will a market mix modeling be conducted really to identify the impact and the ROI of the different advertising channels that were used in the integrated communication plan for 2020? Next slide, please. The website was a key component of this plan and really we punched above its weight in terms of contributing to the response rate and communication activities. So right now we're seeing a split 58% and 42% in terms of paid versus earned in terms of traffic, and 65% of the web traffic actually coming from mobile devices. Was that balance of paid versus earned expected? Can we learn anything from this actual result? And given mobile represents the greater majority of web traffic, what are the implications of this moving forward? We understand that this was already a mobile a site built with mobile in mind, mobile first design. So given the fact that mobile is so prominent and probably will only increase in the future, what are thoughts of moving forward to really leverage this? And I was impressed with the number of custom landing pages developed, over 110. Curious, how did they perform? What specifically drove the success? Was it images? Was it languages? Was it messaging? And then how did he perform to the actual distinct audience segment? Please. A very good presentation on trust and safety, and it was really good to see how the agency was able to step in and really nip these things in the bud. Curious, has an analysis been conducted to identify the themes across these instances? Are there any major and salient themes? And then to what extent did the activities and decisions by the federal government generate any misinformation or disinformation. It would be helpful to know as we move forward and plan for the 2030 census. Next slide, please. And to some additional questions. The partnership program, something that's going to continue. What was the feedback from the partners with regards to materials that were developed? Were any pieces more useful or less useful than others? Did they get them in the quantity they needed? What would they have done differently if they had the chance to? And then we learned a lot about the optimization process from Kale. So I'm wondering, what are those lessons learned from those visual ads? What components drove the higher ISS darts? Was it image? Was it messaging? Was it the length of the message? It'd be helpful to have that information so that we can use that moving forward and make sure not only materials for the next census, but going forward whenever the census needs to engage in communications with the public to really leverage those lessons learned. And then how did you explain the success of the regional pushes on the response rate across geographies and audience groups? Ups and hyperlocal efforts are something that are used in communications plans, and they can really move the dial. So just look under the hood and see what didn't and why, what your hypotheses are. And a question, how was the Senate campaign funded? Was it from the internal budget, moving from one portion to the other? And then is there an actual assessment on the effectiveness of the communication across those incremental or the total 47 languages? So now that it's been proven that it can be done, what is the Census Bureau's point of view on making it part of the base plan moving forward? And that concludes my discussion presentation. Thank you very much.
Whew, that's a lot of questions. What we can do is we can try to start answering some of them. I'm going to tell you we probably can't answer them all right now, but we will provide you with responses in writing after the meeting, or I'm not going to say immediately after the meeting, but following the meeting. I'm just trying to manage expectations. If we could go back, how about I start with the media, all the questions around media. Those are easy to answer. So there is a specific slide on media planning and buying that had a good number of questions on it. If we could go back to that. There we go. All right, so the first one, how did the cancellation, postponement of large audience media events like sports, award shows, et cetera, affect the media plan? Significantly. I mean, we relied heavily on these large events. You get more eyeballs, right? It's a higher reach perspective, but we were not the only ones like that. So we just actually had to quickly pivot and think of alternative ways to get our messages out. What we did was we started piggybacking on things. We looked at what people were looking at. What was the media consumption? They were consuming a lot of news media from a TV perspective, but online, everything went to an online platform. Your award programs went to an online platform. You had a lot of concert series that were done online. Graduations were online. And so we became part of those. We partnered with companies like iHeartMedia and worked through them. For different audiences, we had a whole Caribbean music festival, and we were partnering with them. So Census was a large component of the messaging around that festival. So we just did whatever we had to do to get in where we could fit in, honestly. And then we looked at some different ways to get the messages out. We put flyers on pizza boxes. If we could be anywhere, we were there. And I'm blanking on some of the specifics, but what it did was it basically made us just reevaluate our entire media plan. And we were actually in competition with everyone else who was going through that. So that drove prices higher. And in order to maintain our targeted reach and frequency, we needed to make sure that we were very specific in the outlets that we chose. Again, a lot of news media, a lot of late night. we actually went into programming that at the very beginning we may not have gone into to begin with. We had to remember our goal was to reach everybody and to get them to participate. And sometimes that meant that we had to advertise in places and in ways that would not have normally been considered had all things gone according to plan. So yes, we increased daytime viewing. We were heavy up in news programs and talk show programs. A lot of extra digital. The digital spend dramatically increased. The budget, though, all we did was pivot the budget. If the programs weren't running, we didn't lose the money. We were able to take those funds and within that particular network or media property, take those funds and focus them in another area. And that's how we got through the vast majority of the motivation period. In some cases, like in Puerto Rico, we were actually off air for a period of time. And those funds were just used to fund the extended motivation and the late non-response follow-up phases. Again, we were able to still obtain our reach and frequency goals, which was wonderful. Again, the net effect on the media budget, we did not lose any money. We just reinvested that money into different properties. And paid the relative performance and contribution between paid media and earned media. Interesting, when we first went out to purchase media, when we were out talking to the media outlets, and we were also trying to get earned coverage, so many entities did not want to provide earned coverage unless they could be guaranteed to buy, and that's not how it worked. As we came into all of these complexities around the 2020 census, getting earned media wasn't a problem. They couldn't cover us enough. So, we just started working in concert. We just made sure that all of our messaging was on point. People were saying the same thing. They were using the same talking points. We provided those talking points to our partners so that when they were using earned media and owned media, we were all speaking the same language. We were pushing forth the same messages. And that's what helped. We could not have done it without our partners. And those are partners that we had official partnerships with, and even organizations, agencies, individuals, groups that were promoting the census outside of our entire partnership or paid media landscape. In terms of mixed modeling and whether or not we're going to do an ROI for different advertising channels, we do have I'll have to come back to you on that to give you more details on what we can and can't do based upon the information that was available and how the contract was written to begin with. So can we go to the very next slide, please? Honestly, I think we're going to have to get back to you on the information about the website so that we can bring in somebody specifically from the web team to make our answers as accurate as possible. Next slide. Trust and safety. Jen, I'm going to pass that to you.
Sorry, just fumbling with the mute button, which none of us have figured out how to quickly switch in the past year and a half. Yeah, just a couple of broad comments here. Misinformation and disinformation is funny. You can slice and dice it in a couple different ways. You could figure out what's, in terms of themes, you could look at just what's misinformation and disinformation. I've looked at it myself a couple different ways just for different purposes. You could bin it in themes from which source it's coming from. Is it, misinformation generated by traditional media? Is it coming from international things like we saw with the Home Affairs hoax? You could also look at it in terms of whether it's operational versus reputational. So an operational piece of confusion or misinformation then kind of gets to your second point, which is like around the schedule changes. When is it the last day that I can respond? And it's not quite misinformation, but it's something our team jumps on to make sure that the right information is out there. We didn't see a lot of people intentionally spreading the wrong date, for example. It was more questions and confusion. And the flip side of that would be reputational, right? Are people suggesting, the stimulus check rumor is a great example. People trying to convey that our reputation isn't trustworthy. We will share your information even though we tell you not to, right? So there are different ways you can bend that, but I'd say most of the federal government activities are more confusion, sometimes bleeding into misinformation, but not disinformation.
So I'm actually going to jump in real quick. I noticed we have about 7 minutes left, and we have two NAC members on the queue. So Ioma is up first, and then will be followed by Tom Sands. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much to Kendall, Jen, and Kaylee for just your great information, the work that you all did. Can you tell us, like, how much was spent with communications, right? So trying to figure out what's the ballpark that you spent, and is there anything that you can think about now that you would do differently, particularly for communities that are often undercounted? And are there particular metrics that you're really attending to really gauge the quality of the communications? Again, you did a lot of things, but I'm trying to figure out, are there metrics that you can use to benchmark whether a particular communication driver worked, especially in certain communities like Black communities, Latino communities, et cetera?
I can immediately address the question about the spend. So the overall communications contract, which included all aspects of the campaign, was approximately $645 million. In terms of paid media, and that includes paid media placement, planning, and reporting, that was approximately $367 million. So definitely more than half of the overall spending for the campaign. And you know, it's difficult to determine exactly what worked and what didn't. You know, we listened to our partners, we listened to our partnership specialists, we listened to the media, anyone who had comments on a piece of creative or one of the partnership materials, any of the partnership materials that went out, and we tried to make sure that everything was done in plain language in a way that was easy to understand. In terms of the creative was created by people that represented the audiences for whom the creative was targeted. So that gave it a level of authenticity. We made sure everything was culturally relevant and culturally sensitive, and those are things that really helped. I can say, having worked on the 2000 and the 2010 census, this time around, the concerns and complaints that were lodged regarding our creative were extremely minimal, and I mean minimal, because I swear I get them all. And even in terms of the media buys, the complaints were minimal. I think the transparency that we had, the level of testing that we had, and our willingness to pivot whenever we needed to pivot, to do the micro-targeting, to provide as much to our partners as possible, even so far as what we did for the campaign optimization and trust and safety, showed that we were really trying to do the right thing. We were trying to speak directly to the audiences and speak to them in a way that they understood. We didn't talk to them, we spoke with them, and that made a difference. Now, what worked and what didn't work, ours is not the only information out there. If we were the only people advertising or putting out any kind of information, we might have more, but there are so many partners that were involved in this. Again, and I said earlier, there were organizations and individuals and groups that were not officially associated with us that were promoting participation in the census. So when you have that many voices out there, it's difficult to tease out exactly what worked, what didn't work. And if you ask anybody where they saw anything, the first thing they're going to say is television. They don't remember that they saw it online or that they saw it in print. It's just, we tried that and it didn't work. We tried to evaluate that in 2000, it didn't work. We did a somewhat evaluation in 2010, that didn't work. And it's being able to create some kind of evaluation measure that starts at the very beginning that can somehow tease out just what census does. And that has proven to be extremely difficult, especially as it becomes, like in 2020, such a charged activity with so many eyeballs and so many people that wanted to either, we're trying so hard to make sure that this was successful.
Okay, just looking at the time, we've got about 3 minutes left, so we'll go with Tom, and hopefully we can also get Flo in. Thanks.
Tom, just a moment. It's Shauna Banks. Can we please go to the discussion slide, please? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kendall, and the other presenters. I have 3 questions. I want to try to get them out very quickly. I understand if you're not able to respond to them today, but I would like to get responses. The first is, as the Bureau collects more information about differential undercount in the 2020 census, what is the mechanism to then look anew at how the integrated communications might have been reshaped to address the differential undercount that actually ended up occurring? The second question, somewhat related, is what is the mechanism to evaluate, revisit the structure of the integrated communications plan? And I'm going to raise an issue that I know, Kendall, we've discussed before, and that is, my recollection is that the subcontract for the Latino community, a subcontractor, was directed to do Spanish language advertising. Although I know some of that was then taken by the general campaign and translated into English, I'm concerned that in the future, really, there needs to be an English language, Latino-directed component of the integrated communications plan to successfully reach a community that is going to show, I believe, a significant differential undercount. So what's the mechanism to revisit, reevaluate the structure of the integrated communications plan? And the last question is an issue I've raised before. I am very concerned that the politicization of the census in this last decennial, not from the Bureau, of course, but from other sources, creates potentially very enduring problems about misinformation. We've got a situation now where, unfortunately, people in this country see this as a zero-sum game. If they reduce the count in other communities and increase the count in their own community, that somehow they benefit from that long term. I think that's a major change. So what is the mechanism, if any, to evaluate whether overall views about the census have changed significantly and how that might translate into differences for integrated communications in 2030? So I know, really complicated questions. Hope I got them out quickly. I know you probably can't answer now, but in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And actually, looking at the time, I would just ask maybe if you could also make note of Flo's question and also get back to her. She asked in the chat, what % of the overall spending was targeted to undercounted communities, and what about households with young children? And then perhaps we will get ahead someplace else in the schedule and be able to bring you back and maybe provide some of these answers live over the course of the next day or two. And with that, I'm looking at the clock. We were actually right on time. I'm going to turn it back over to Karen.
Okay. Thank you very much, James. Thank you to our presenters and our discussants. We actually have time for a short break at this moment, and we will come back and start our next presentation at 12:45. So we just have a little bit under a 10-minute break. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for standing by. I would now like to turn the conference back over to Karen Battle. Thank you so much. You may begin.
Welcome back, everyone. I just have a quick reminder before we begin our next presentation that information for closed captioning services can be found on the NAC website. At this time, we will now hear from Nicholas Jones, Roberto Ramirez, and Eric Jensen, who will present racial and ethnic diversity in the United States, a few highlights from the 2020 census, and that will be followed by discussants Taiku Lee and committee discussion. So take it away, Nicholas.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicholas Jones. I'm the director of the Census Bureau's Race, Ethnicity Research and Outreach program in our Population Division, and it's really great to meet with all of you today. We welcome this opportunity to talk with you about statistics from the 2020 census on race and ethnicity and the measures of diversity that we developed to communicate the results for our nation and for communities across the country. As our nation has grown, we've continued to evolve in how we measure the race and ethnicity of the people who live here. Roberto Ramirez is our Census Bureau's Assistant Division Chief for Special Population Statistics, which includes race, ethnicity, age, and sex statistics in our Population Division. And the 2020 Census redistricting data provide a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition of the country as a result of the improvements that we made in the design of the race ethnicity questions and the improvements we made to our data processing and our coding of what people tell us. Eric Jensen is our Census Bureau Senior Technical Expert for Demographic Analysis, also in our Population Division. And as we talked about these improvements for 2020, we know they yield a more accurate portrait of how people self-identify in response to two separate questions on Hispanic origin and race. These changes and improvements reveal that the U.S. population is much more multiracial and more diverse than what we measured in the past. Roberto and Eric and I look forward to the discussion with you today and to addressing your questions about these results. Next slide, please. Our presentation today will discuss the improvements we made for the 2020 Census race and Hispanic origin data. We'll also have highlights on racial and ethnic composition and diversity at the national and state level. The 2020 Census data provide a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition and the racial and ethnic diversity of our nation. And to help the public examine the redistricting results, for the nation and state and counties across the country, we released 2 America Count stories, which are shown here and available on our website, census.gov. Together, the stories provide this new snapshot of our nation's population and how interconnected we are. Next slide, please. While the Census Bureau successfully tested and recommended a combined question format for the 2020 Census, we followed the 1997 standards set by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, and we used 2 separate questions to collect data on race and ethnicity. Our research over the past decade, however, did show that we could make improvements to the 2020 Census race and ethnicity separate question designs within the OMB guidelines. Before we talk about the results from 2020, we'll discuss the improvements that were made to the question design, to the coding, and to the data processing, and how these improvements impact the data. On the next slide, within the context of the United States decennial census, the concepts of race and ethnicity follow the standards set by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. The minimum OMB categories for data on race and ethnicity for federal statistics, for program administrative reporting, and civil rights compliance reporting are defined as follows. The OMB requires 2 minimum categories for data on ethnicity, Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino. The OMB standards require 5 minimum categories for race, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white, and people may report multiple races in response to this question. The Census Bureau is also required by the U.S. Congress to use the category some other race. On the next slide, you can see the 2020 Census questions again, and here we'll emphasize that the race ethnicity question format requires 2 separate questions to adhere to the 1997 standards, while a separate Middle Eastern or North African or MENA response category was not specifically included. Detailed MENA responses were elicited, collected, and coded. Per the 1997 standards, MENA responses are classified and tabulated as part of the white racial category. While we tested an alternative design in 2015, we used the format for collecting race and ethnicity of 2 separate questions for self-response as required by the OMB standards. Our testing did show, however, that we could make improvements to the 2020 Census race and ethnicity questions within these OMB guidelines. And overall, several significant changes were made, and we'll go through these in the next several slides. On the next slide, we just have some highlights to emphasize that building on our extensive research and outreach last decade, we made several improvements to the designs for 2020 in the ways that we process the data and the ways that we code what people tell us in response to these questions. The improvements and changes enable a more thorough and a more accurate depiction of how people self-identify within 2 separate questions, yielding a more accurate portrait in this format's design output.
Nicholas, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Nicholas, but we're hearing some noise in the background, so we would like to ask the participants to please mute. We'd like to ask committee members to please mute yourself so we don't hear the background noise. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Thank you, Karen. So I encourage you to check out our improvements webinar and blog that we released earlier this summer to learn more about these important changes and to see how they impact your understanding of the results. Overall, the changes reveal that the U.S. population is much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than what we measured in the past. On the next slide, we'll talk about the 2020 Census Hispanic Origin question and the improvements that we made. The question design includes the same 3 detailed checkboxes that were included in 2010, Mexican, Mexican Am, and Chicano, Puerto Rican, and Cuban, along with a yes, another Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin checkbox. There were 2 changes for the 2020 Census Hispanic Origin question design. First, the instruction to print origin for example was revised to print for example. In our research, we found that this revised instruction allowed respondents to understand what the question was asking them to report, and it didn't limit their write-in response by confusing the instruction with other terms like origin, which mean different things to different people. And second, the example groups were updated to Salvadoran, Dominican, Colombian, Guatemalan, Spaniard, Ecuadorian, etc., in order to represent the largest Hispanic origin population groups in the United States and the geographic diversity of the Hispanic or Latino category as defined by the 97 OMB standards. On the next slide, we see that we also made several design improvements to the race question for the 2020 census results, based on our research and our outreach over the past decade. First, in response to community feedback over the last decade, we added a dedicated write-in response area and examples for the white racial category and for the Black or African American racial category. Second, we provided 6 example groups for each of the white, Black or African American, and American Indian or Alaska Native racial categories for the first time. These examples represent the largest population groups within each of the race categories' geographically based definitions as defined by the 1997 standards. Third, based on successful testing last decade, the term Negro was removed from the 2020 census by updating the category Black, African Am, or Negro to Black or African American. Fourth, we reordered the detailed Asian checkboxes and the detailed Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander checkboxes by population size. Fifth, we changed the checkbox category Guamanian or Chamorro to Chamorro based on research and positive community feedback. And sixth, we updated the write-in instructions for the Some Other Race category to better solicit detailed reporting. We updated the instruction for 2020 to read print, race, or origin to correspond with the overall question instruction to mark one or more boxes and print origins. Next, I'll talk about how the race and ethnicity coding improvements that we put in place for the 2020 census help to provide you with an understanding of our overall coding operation. For the 2020 census, we made many improvements to our code list to reflect the myriad responses people report to the Hispanic origin question and the race question. Prior to 2020, our code list did not include very many unique codes for detailed white groups or detailed Black or African American groups, as these were not elicited as part of the question design in the past. For example, if a respondent reported that they were Jordanian in 2010, they did not receive a unique code for Jordanian, but they were coded in an aggregate other Arab code. Because of our code list improvements for 2020, we now have unique codes for hundreds of detailed white groups and hundreds of detailed Black groups. Many of these new groups were added from our ancestry code list, where we have historically collected data on detailed white groups and detailed Black groups. But we also received a lot of great help from outside researchers and expert scholars who provided feedback to us on which groups we should code and how they should be coded. Throughout the decade from 2010 to 2020, we consulted with researchers and scholars, community leaders, and tribal leaders to improve our code list for all of the Hispanic origin and race category groups. These critical updates and additions of more detailed codes than ever before give us the ability to tabulate data for many, many more detailed groups than we ever have in past decennial censuses. We implemented our new code list, and you can see on the next slide, for the 2020 census during our very successful coding operation. If you're not familiar with it, the coding operation consists of 2 phases. The first phase is automated coding. In this phase, all of the write-in responses that come from respondents are attempted to match exactly with what we have in our database that we refer to as the master file. The master file contains thousands of unique write-ins from previous censuses and demographic surveys that we've recoded with our updated race ethnicity code list for 2020. Because of the incredible research and updates that we made, about 99% of the write-ins are coded this way, automatically. That's right, 99%. The The remaining 1% of write-ins that cannot be automatically coded are sent to be manually coded in our residual coding operation. Clerks at our National Processing Center, or NPC, are trained by our expert team and population division to review and code the write-in responses to ensure that all write-in responses from the public we received are accurately coded. The next slide provides a very important perspective for the coding operation. Here, the table shows us the number of race and Hispanic origin write-ins that we processed in the 2010 census and the number of write-ins for the 2020 census. Now, back in 2010, we processed 37.7 million write-ins to the race question. In 2020, with the collection of write-ins among all racial categories, we processed 335 million write-in responses. For the Hispanic origin question in 2020, we processed 17.1 million write-ins, compared with 15 million write-ins in 2010. In total, for both questions in 2020, we processed 295.8 million more write-in responses in 2020 than in 2010. And remember, we successfully auto-coded 99% of these 350 million responses from the public. It's a really amazing and a critical accomplishment that led to our work for 2020 census results. The next slide provides a summary of the processing and the coding improvements that we made to the 2020 census and the race and Hispanic origin questions. If you could advance to the next slide, please. In the 2020 census, our procedures only captured the first 30 characters of the written responses. Sorry, if you don't mind to just go back one slide. Thank you. Thanks. In the 2010 census, our procedures only captured the first 30 characters of written responses. The coding procedures also coded up to 2 write-in responses for each write-in line. Our research over the past decade found that people were reporting longer and more complex and more detailed responses to these questions. Based on this research and community feedback, we made updates for the 2020 census so that we could more fully reflect and more accurately reflect the complex details of how people report their racial and ethnic identities in response to 2 separate questions. Based on research and testing and outreach throughout the decade, we updated how we captured and how we coded responses for the 2020 census race and Hispanic origin questions. We increased the number of characters that were collected from 30 characters to 200 characters, which allowed us to capture and fully recognize longer and more complex write-in responses. Instead of prioritizing multiple responses into only 2 codes, we coded up to 6 detailed codes for each write-in area. This increase effectively gave all write-in responses an equal opportunity to be coded into one of the 6 major race categories. It also simplified our coding work in that it removed duplicate or repetitive terms to reduce responses to 2 codes. And we fully and successfully tested these coding and question improvements in the 2015 National Content Test and finalized them in the 2018 Census Test. Okay, on to the next slide, please. These examples illustrate how a response was coded in 2010 versus 2020. The first example on the top shows that in the 2010 census, the response of Mexican American Indian, Portuguese, and African American was not fully coded because it was longer than 30 characters. Only the text outlined by the red box was captured and coded in 2010. The additional text was not captured and therefore was not seen and could not be coded. Therefore, the responses of Portuguese and African American were not part of the text string that could be coded as they weren't seen in the data processing. The second example shows that if the same write-in response was provided in 2020, all of the text outlined in red was captured. We captured up to 200 characters per write-in line. And this enabled all 3 terms of Mexican American Indian, Portuguese, and African American to be fully recognized and coded. In another major improvement on the next slide for the 2020 census, we'll talk about how we used a single code list for coding race data and Hispanic origin data in response to both questions. In previous censuses, we had 2 separate code lists, one for Hispanic origin question and one for the race question. Previously, these code lists focused on providing codes for either detailed Hispanic origin groups or detailed race groups. By combining the code list into one, we expanded the number of detailed groups that could be coded in each question. And we also expanded our code list to include additional detailed white groups and additional detailed Black or African American groups, as the race question elicited a collection of these detailed responses for the first time through the use of dedicated write-in areas. Next slide, please. During the 2010 census, if someone provided more than 2 write-in responses in the Hispanic origin question write-in area, we prioritized coding Hispanic origin groups over race groups, as that was the purpose of this question. In the 2020 census, subject matter experts coded what they saw, coding up to 6 responses from left to right, regardless of the Hispanic origin group or the race group. This enabled all responses to be treated equally. The following examples illustrate this coding change for the Hispanic origin question. A write-in response of Black Peruvian was coded as Black and Peruvian in both 2010 and 2020. In this example, although there is a Hispanic origin response in the write-in line, because there are only 2 responses, both the Hispanic and the race response were coded in 2010. Similarly, in the next example, a response of White Puerto Rican was coded as White and Puerto Rican in both 2010 and 2020, because again, there were only 2 write-in responses. In the third example, Spaniard, White, Honduran, the response of White was not coded in 2010 because of the prioritization of Hispanic origin responses over race responses, when there were more than 2 responses in the write-in line. In 2020, all 3 of the responses were coded. In the last example, Mexican, Black, and Colombian, the response of Black was not coded in 2010 because of the prioritization of Hispanic origin responses over race responses, again, when there were more than 2 responses in a write-in line. In 2020, all 3 of the responses were coded. In the Hispanic origin question, after coding up to 6 responses on that write-in line, like the 2010 census, only 1 response is permitted to be tabulated for Hispanic origin in accordance with the 1997 standards. Next slide, please. This coding change doesn't impact the Hispanic origin data for the 2020 census redistricting file. As we just saw in 2010, the example write-in response for the Hispanic origin question of Black, Colombian, and Peruvian was coded as Colombian and Peruvian, and the response of Black was not coded in 2010 because it's a race response. In 2020, we coded all 3 of the responses, and all 3 of these codes are retained internally for research purposes. For the official redistricting file tabulations, this response is tabulated as Hispanic or Latino. Following the 1997 standards, respondents can only be Hispanic or not Hispanic. As long as the respondent provides at least 1 Hispanic origin response, they are tabulated as Hispanic or Latino. Next, with the next slide, I'll talk about the coding rules for the race question and the improvements that we made for 2020. The 2010 census used a complex series of coding rules to determine how to prioritize and how to assign up to 2 codes for each unique text string. In 2010, if more than 2 groups are part of a write-in text string on the same line in the race question, our coding procedures prioritized coding race groups over Hispanic origin groups and other types of responses because we were limited to only coding 2 responses per line. In the 2020 census, our subject matter experts coded what they saw, coding up to 6 responses from left to right, regardless of race group or Hispanic origin group. And again, this enabled all responses to be treated equally. The following examples on the slide illustrate this coding change. First, a response of Hispanic white was coded as Hispanic and white in both 2010 and in 2020. In this example, although there's a Hispanic origin response in the write-in, because there were only 2 responses, both responses were coded in 2010. Similarly, a response of Black Latino was coded as Black and Latino in both 2010 and 2020, again because there were only 2 responses in that text string. In the third example, a response of Hispanic, white, and Chinese was coded as white and Chinese in 2010 because of the prioritization of race responses over Hispanic responses when there were more than 2 in the race question text string. In 2020, all 3 responses were coded. And in the last example, a response of Spanish, Mexican, Samoan, and Chamorro was only coded as Samoan and Chamorro in 2010, and the responses of Spanish and Mexican were not coded, again because of the prioritization of race responses, when there were more than 2 responses in a write-in line. In 2020, all 4 of these responses in the text string were coded. On the next slide, we can see how this improvement to the coding rules impacts our final data for the race question by recognizing the rich and complex detailed identities reported by respondents. Let's look at the example again of Cuban, Thai, and Filipino. In 2010, even though Cuban was written first on this text string as shown in the green text, the responses of Thai and Filipino were prioritized over Cuban because they are detailed race groups. Cuban was not coded or included in the race tabulation configuration because of the two race groups being prioritized over it in coding. The redistricting data tabulates major race groups, so this response was tabulated as part of the Asian alone race category in 2010, representing Thai and Filipino. In 2020, all three groups in the write-in response were coded, and the tabulation for PL would be Asian, representing Thai and Filipino, and some other race, representing Cuban. Next, Roberto's going to talk about the results from the 2020 census and how these improvements that we made provide a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition of our nation. Roberto?
Thank you, Nicholas. Good afternoon, everyone. My pleasure to be here. I hope you all are still with us. I know that's a lot of information that we're sharing with you, but we're very excited to do that. Next, I'm going to highlight some major findings from the 2020 census, many of which you know already, but let me just walk you through these as a fresh reminder. So for the next segment of our presentation, I will discuss the 2020 census results, illuminate the racial and ethnic composition of the United States population. The first component of this composition is shown in this current slide for ethnicity statistics, which come from the Hispanic origin question. From this data, as you can see, we counted over 62 million Hispanics, 62.1 million to be exact, in 2020. Next slide, please. We have the second component of this composition also for racial statistics. These statistics come from the separate question on race. To frame the discussion on racial composition, we use concepts of race alone, race in combination, and race alone in combination. These concepts have been in place since the 2000 census, when we first started collecting multiple race reporting. And the three concepts are central to understanding our country's changing demographics. The 2020 census statistics provide a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition of our country, and we'll take a look at the results in the next few slides. Next slide, please. On this slide, we see the white population remains the largest race or ethnicity group in the United States, with 204.3 million people identifying as white alone, and 235.4 million people identifying as white alone or in combination with another race group. Next slide, please. Of this slide, we're talking about the two or more race population, or known as the multiracial population, and we counted 33.8 million people identifying in such a way in the 2020 census. Next, we see that the some other race alone or in combination was at 49.9 million, surpassing the Black and African American alone or in combination population, which was counted at 46.9 million, as the second largest race alone or in combination group. Next slide, please. We see that the next largest racial populations were the Asian alone or in combination at 24 million people. Next slide, please. American Indian Alaska Native alone or in combination group at 9.7 million people. Next slide, please. And the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander alone or in combination group at 1.6 million people. You know, over the last decade, actually over the last few decades, we conducted several content tests to determine the optimal design for the race ethnicity questions. The 2015 National Content Test was the largest race and ethnicity content test ever conducted, sampling over 1.2 million housing units in the United States, including Puerto Rico. The test explored several questionnaire designs to improve the way we measure race and ethnicity. The results of the research over the last decade indicated that the optimal question design format for race and ethnicity was using a combined question with detailed checkboxes. Employing the separate questions format in the 2020 census resulted in reporting patterns and results in the data that we are seeing now in the 2020 census, which are actually more pronounced than the results in the 2015 National Content Test. In fact, to be quite honest, the results that we're seeing in the 2020 census are really no surprise to us, because we saw these very similar race and ethnicity reporting patterns back in 2015 during the National Content Test. This slide shows the recent distribution of race for Hispanic origin respondents by question format for the 2015 National Content Test. The results for the separate question format, similar to what was used in the 2020 census, are represented in the blue bars. The red bars and the green bars are results from the combined question designs that we tested back in 2015. One of the most notable findings from our research was that while the separate question produced some other race reporting for Hispanics as high as 39%, combined question designs yielded a substantially reduced some other race population to about 0.5%. Additionally, in the separate question designs, over 38% of Hispanics reported 2 or more races, compared to less than 6% in the combined question formats. Now, these findings suggest that the Hispanic respondents do not solely identify with the major OND race groups. This is critical to keep in mind as we continue to evaluate and discuss the findings from the 2020 census. Next slide, please. We are confident that the differences in the overall racial distributions are largely due to the improvements in the design of separate questions to the race question and Hispanic questions that Nicholas just discussed, and the processing of the data, and as well as the demographic changes over the last 10 years. We are also confident, as shown in our research over the last decade, that using a single combined question for race ethnicity in the decennial census will ultimately yield an even more accurate portrait of how the U.S. population self-identifies, especially for people who identify with more than one race or the multiracial ethnic population. Next slide, please. We describe these results in our American Count stories that hopefully you have seen and read our American Count stories that we released back in August, and 12th of August to be exact. These results are not surprising as they align, as I mentioned before, with the expert research that we have done in the past. And these improvements more accurately illustrate the richness and complexity of how people identify their race and ethnicity in the separate question formats and using the current OND standards which remain in effect. Next slide, please. Now, there are multiple approaches to presenting and understanding data on race and ethnicity. These concepts are emphasized in our reports and presentations where we use the concepts of race alone, race in combination, and race alone in combination, as well as Hispanics by race. These concepts have been in place since the Census 2000, and our concepts are central to understanding our country's changing demographics. One common way to examine data on race and ethnicity is to cross-tabulate Hispanic by race using statistics for redistricting tables, such as like Table P2 shown on this slide. In this table, the Hispanic population is shown by distinct table row, followed by the non-Hispanic or Latino population, and then cross-tabulated by non-Hispanic. For the 6 non-Hispanic race alone groups and for the full set of 57 non-Hispanic multiple race combinations as shown on the slide. In the companion American Count story that we released on August 12th, we illustrate how the 2020 census results allow us to measure the nation's diversity and how it varies geographically throughout the country. Eric now is going to discuss these diversity findings with you. Eric?
Thanks, Roberto. Are you able to hear me okay? Great, thank you. So next slide. Our American Count story on racial and ethnic diversity highlights the multiple measures of racial and ethnic diversity that we explored with 2020 census data. For these measures, we cross-tabulate the race and Hispanic origin statistics, as Roberto advised the data users often do, such as with the 2020 census redistricting table P2. In this data format, the results are not impacted by the race reporting patterns of Hispanic or Latino respondents, as the Hispanic or Latino population is included as a category alongside the racial categories. Thus, we are confident that the changes we're seeing from 2010 to 2020 in the diversity measures, which are calculated again using mutually exclusive Hispanic origin and race groups, likely reflect actual demographic changes in the population over the past 10 years, as well as improvements to the question design, data processing, and coding. Next slide. Our measures of diversity enable us to see how all racial and ethnic groups are distributed across the country to inform our understanding of diversity. Our definition for diversity refers to the representation and relative size of different racial and ethnic groups within a population. Diversity is maximized when all groups are represented in an area and have equal shares of the population. We are using several approaches to measure racial and ethnic diversity of the U.S. population. These include the Diversity Index, prevalence rankings, and the diffusion score, and a series of prevalence maps. We'll talk through each of these measures in turn in the next few minutes. Next slide, please. To help set the stage with the next slide, we present a state-level map using data from the 2010 census. The map shows the geographic distribution of the diversity index across the country from state to state. The states shown in dark green were more diverse, with a diversity index score of 65 or more in 2010. States shown in light green were less diverse in 2010. The diversity index measure tells us the probability that two people chosen at random will be from different race and ethnicity groups. The diversity index is bounded between 0 and 1. The value of 0 indicates that everyone in the population has the same racial and ethnic characteristics. A value close to 1 indicates that almost everyone in the population has different racial and ethnic characteristics. And we, to make it easier to interpret, we converted the probabilities to a percentage by multiplying by 100. Next slide, please. The next we have a map showing the diversity index for the 2020 census. In 2020, at the national level, there was a 61.1% chance that two people chosen at random were from different race and ethnicity groups. And this is higher than in 2010, when the diversity index score for the United States was 54.9%. Next slide. In general, states with the highest diversity index scores in the 2020 census are found in the West, for instance, Hawaii, California, Nevada. In the South, Maryland and Texas, along with the District of Columbia, a state equivalent. And in the Northeast, we have New Jersey and New York. In 2020, Hawaii had the highest diversity index score at 76%, followed by California with 69.7% and Nevada with 68.8%. You can see the diversity index for all states using our interactive Tableau data visualization on diversity, which we released on our website in August. Next slide, please. Another approach that we used to measure diversity in the 2020 census was prevalence rankings. Here we focus on the largest race and ethnicity groups for a given geography. In 2020, the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, became the largest racial or ethnic group in California, comprising 39.4% of the total population. This is up from 37.6% in 2010. Black or African American alone, not Hispanic, which is shown in blue, was the most prevalent group for the District of Columbia. Asian alone, not Hispanic, shown in red, was the most prevalent group in Hawaii. The Hispanic or Latino population was also the most prevalent group in New Mexico and Puerto Rico. Next slide. Looking at the next image, we also saw shifts in the second most prevalent group for some states in 2020. These are shown in that second column. In West Virginia, the multiracial, not Hispanic population, which is shown in teal at 4%, became the second most prevalent group. In Wisconsin, the Hispanic or Latino population became the second most prevalent group. In Texas, the first most prevalent group and the second most prevalent group rankings did not change between 2010 and 2020, but the difference in size between the white alone, not Hispanic population, which was the largest, that's in orange, and the Hispanic or Latino population in green, shrank to about 0.5%. It's also interesting in the District of Columbia, the difference in the size of the Black or African American alone, not Hispanic population, which is in blue, and the white alone, not Hispanic population in orange, narrowed dramatically in 2020, only a 2.9 percentage point difference, and this was down from 15.2 percentage points difference in 2010. Next slide, please. I'll go back a slide, please. Thank you. As another diversity measure, we also present the diffusion score, which measures the percentage of the population that is not in the first, second, or third largest race and ethnic groups combined. This metric, shown in gray on the far right of the table here, tells us how diverse and unconcentrated the population is relative to the largest groups. The 2020 census results showed that Hawaii was the state with the highest diffusion score at 21.8%, followed by Alaska at 17.9%, Oklahoma at 17.8%, and Nevada at 16%. Next slide. Finally, we use a series of prevalence maps to show geographic distributions and patterns in racial and ethnic diversity across the country. The first map displayed here shows the most prevalent race or ethnicity group by county for 2020. In 2020, the white alone, not Hispanic population, shown in orange, was the most prevalent group in about 90% of counties. The Black or African American alone, not Hispanic population, shown in blue, was the most prevalent group in some counties in the South. The Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, was the most prevalent group in counties in the Southwest and West. In addition, the American Indian Alaska Native alone, not Hispanic population, shown in purple, was the most prevalent racial or ethnic group in counties in Alaska, the Four Corners region, and the Upper Great Plains. Next slide. There's more variation in the map for the second most prevalent racial or ethnic group, shown here in the slide. What we see now is that more racial or ethnic groups are represented, and the patterns are not as tightly clustered in specific regions. For example, the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, as the second largest, most prevalent group, span the entire continental United States, with large numbers of counties in every region. The multiracial non-Hispanic population, shown in teal, was the second most prevalent group in many counties throughout the northern part of the country. Counties where the Black or African American alone, not Hispanic population, shown in blue, was the second most prevalent group, are mostly concentrated in the South, but we also see them in parts of the Northeast and Midwest. Next slide, please. We encourage you to use our interactive data visualizations to explore the maps and graphics which illustrate the 2020 census results as well as data from the 2010 census. You can use the Race Ethnicity Composition Data Viz tool to zoom in and see the racial and ethnic group distributions for states and counties across the country. You can use the Diversity Data Viz tool to zoom in and see diversity index, prevalence rankings, and prevalence maps distributions for states and counties across the country. You can also toggle back and forth between the 2010 data and the 2020 census data using the interactive tool buttons. You can access these data visualizations from the census.gov website, and our Census Bureau colleagues have produced data gems, which are short videos to walk you through how to use the data visualizations. So the links are available on the slide and also in the 2020 PL Press Kit. Next slide, please. So we also encourage you to read our America Count stories on the Census.gov website. The stories describe in great detail the improvements we made for the 2020 census, which yield a more accurate portrait of how people self-identify in response to two separate questions on Hispanic origin and race. Our analyses of the 2020 census results show that the U.S. population is much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than what we measured in the past. These measures of racial and ethnic diversity help inform the public about the diversity and the complexity of the racial and ethnic composition of our country. These diversity measures complement the 2020 census redistricting data release, and the data enable us to explore the richness of our nation's population in a new light. With that, I'll turn it back over to Nicholas.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Roberto. On the next slide, just to summarize our presentation today, we've discussed how improving the 2020 census questions on Hispanic origin and race, along with improving our data processing and our coding procedures, enable us to have a more complete picture of the detailed identities reported by the U.S. population in 2020. The 2020 census and 2010 census race data comparisons should be made with caution, taking into account the improvements that we made as we discussed in our America Count stories. The results are not surprising. They align with our expert research and corresponding findings this past decade about the impacts of question format on race and ethnicity reporting. These improvements more accurately illustrate the richness and the complexity of how people respond in respect to two separate questions within the current OMB standards. Next slide, please. Over the next few months, we'll continue to investigate the 2020 census race and ethnicity data at lower levels of geography to inform our understanding of the racial and ethnic composition of the United States and the demographic patterns and reporting patterns within 2020 among respondents. At the same time, we're continuing to develop and solicit feedback on detailed race, ethnicity, and tribal data products that we know are critical to so many of our data users. And you'll hear more about that in the next session. We're also beginning to think through our research and testing needs as we move towards 2030, which will include discussions with stakeholders, with advisors, and with OMB. As we develop plans for 2030, pending resources and the availability of funding, Census Bureau experts will evaluate the results of the 2020 census race and ethnicity data, consult with advisors such as yourselves, as well as stakeholders and our colleagues at OMB and other federal agencies on potential new areas for future research. The Census Bureau remains committed to improving the accuracy and the reliability of census results by researching approaches that more accurately measure and reflect how people self-identify. Finally, on the last slide, we have 3 questions for the NAC members to consider as you enter into today's discussion. First, we are continuing to research how we can present information on racial and ethnic diversity from the 2020 Census PL results. Are there any additional measures or approaches that you recommend we explore? Second, we shared our major findings on race and ethnicity from the 2020 census with you today. What major takeaways have you found in the data from your local areas and or communities that we have not discussed? Third, do you have a recommendation for future research explorations to help improve statistics on race and ethnicity data? Thank you. On behalf of Roberto and Eric, we want to thank you for all of your feedback today, and we look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thanks so much, Nicholas, and we now have Teku Lee with the discussant presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I am really appreciative of that very careful, detailed, really fascinating presentation from Nicholas Jones, Roberto Ramirez, and Eric Jensen. The key summary, as I hear it, is simple, but so important. Changes in the ethnicity and race questions and how they are coded and counted result in a more accurate portrait of the incredible diversity in how Americans self-identify in ethnic and racial terms. That overall summary has to be right. We know from our daily encounters and experiences where we live and work and travel, and from data projects like the American Community Survey and research leading up to the decennial census, that the United States is incredibly diverse ethnically and racially and getting more and more diverse year by year. And the 2020 census results compared to 2010 capture that change. From that standpoint, it is incredibly exciting to see change and improvements in how the census is measuring race and ethnicity in a way that better corresponds to the incredible and expanding diversity that is the United States population in 2021. Furthermore, the data visualizations, the reports, the data tables, and statistics like diversity index, diffusion score, prevalence, these are all fascinating and great resources to better understand at different levels of geography and in different cuts at the data how the nation's population is transforming. And so that is all to the good. I want to focus my questions, curiosities, follow-ups around an alternate summary of what I see in the presentation. So if I can have the next slide, please. Namely, that changes in question wording and response codes in 2020 result in a change in our description of the ethnic and racial composition in the United States. In one sense, this alternate summary is no different, but in at least 3 respects, I think they point us in different directions, and I'm going to formulate these in terms of the following questions. First, is the change a change in measurement accuracy or a change in survey context coding rules post-survey adjustments? The latter could be the same as the former, but it also could be different. Second, is more accurate the same thing as accurate? What I mean by this is even if we're persuaded that 2020 was an improvement over 2010, aren't there still problems with measurement, and isn't there still room for improvement as we think ahead to 2030? And third, this is a smaller but still important point. When the census presentation states that 2020 results in a more accurate portrait of how people self-identify, is it equally self-identification in each case? Or to put it in different words, is self-administration really the same thing as self-identification? Let me elaborate, and I'll apologize a little bit in advance that my comments are a little bit academic, and you can take that in all the good, bad, and ugly senses of that term, academic. Can I get the next slide, please? So to the first question, is this change in measurement accuracy or change in question wording and coding rules? The first thing to note is that the front of the store changes in ethnicity and race questions are not the only changes in 2020, and the presentation well elaborated on that. So in the back of the store, there are also code list improvements that we just heard about, and the more detailed white and black groups in 2020. This produces is a clear improvement in data quality and usable data. And so here I just have a very quick and simple follow-up, which is when and how will the Census Bureau decide on which data projects to publish for these newly detailed white and black groups, and can the NAC have input into this process? Next slide, please. So also in the back of the store, there is auto-coding and residual coding of the write-in answers that further describe Americans by ethnicity and race. When the write-ins match the Census Bureau's master files, the responses are automatically coded. And as Nicholas Jones mentioned, that happened in 99% of the cases, and that is a reassuringly high number, period, paragraph. But there are still a couple of aspects of how the write-ins were handled that I wanted to follow up on. One is one that I'm genuinely puzzled about is the lower number of Hispanic write-ins in 2020 compared to 2010. There were 17.1 million write-ins for Hispanic ethnicity in 2010 and only 15 million in 2020. And by contrast, there were 38 million write-ins for the race categories in 2010 and 336 million in 2020. So I might be missing something really obvious, but I'm really curious to know what explains why the number of write-ins for the race categories would blow up in 2020, while the number of write-ins for the Hispanic ethnicity category would go slightly in the opposite direction. So is it just that the coding rule alone explains this? Is it also attributable to other things like revisions and additions to the example groups that were given for the ethnicity and race questions? Just curious to hear some thoughts about that. Then a second follow-up on auto-coding and residual coding is where is the remaining 1% that was processed using the residual coding system? How is that 1% distributed between the ethnicity question and the race question? And within the race question, where is the 1% across the different race categories? 1% may seem like a really small number, quite literally a residual, but if that 1% for the entire U.S. population falls disproportionately to one question or to one racial category, then even that small 1% could loom a lot larger. Next slide, please. So next I wanted to add a bit more texture to the question of change as measurement accuracy or change as different survey context and new coding rules by turning to the question, does more accurate equal accurate? And one way to motivate that question is to put the 2020 count up against the one-time plans to change the 2020 diversity question even more radically. And here I'm referring to proposals to combine the ethnicity and race questions into one question and to add a MENA category. In measurement terms, when you design a closed-ended question to ask, the response categories, in theory, should be meaningful to whoever you're asking the question to, and they should encompass to the maximum extent possible the full range of answers that people might give to that question. So in short, residual response categories like other or some other race should be exactly that. It should be residual. So all else equal, if you have two ways to ask a closed-ended question, the one that generates fewer residual responses like other is the better question. And yet, if the numbers are right, if I had the numbers right, the 2020 census resulted in a 129% increase in the number of other race responses from 21.7 million in 2010 to nearly 50 million in 2020. So 15% of Americans see the response categories to the 2020 race question, and in effect, they do not see themselves in terms of question size. The Pew Research Center fielded a survey earlier this spring in which they found that when shown the 2020 census questions, only 49% of a representative sample of adult Americans said the census race and ethnicity questions reflect how they see their race and origin very well. And that, alarmingly high number was roughly equal whether the respondents were white, black, or Latinx. So I don't know if this is already available somewhere, but I'm especially curious here how Americans who identified as Hispanic to the ethnicity question saw themselves when they got to the race question in total. So especially since most of the other race category identifiers in previous censuses have been Latino. So specifically, a question here would be what percentage of, this is in slide 27, the 2 or more races category are Hispanic identifiers. So slide 27 shows that 39% of Hispanics identify only as some other race, and then 38% identify with 2 or more races. So what I'm wondering here is, can we pull out from those numbers the total percentage of Hispanic identifiers who, in effect, do not find themselves in the race question? That is, who pick other race either alone or in combination. I have a very short 5-second aside, small clarifying question from that slide 27. It shows about 1% of Latino responses to the race question being classified as invalid. I'm just curious what makes a response invalid. Then, as another group that may not fully see themselves in the race question, I also wonder what percent of the 2 or more races population also identified as white with a Middle East, North African right-end response. If significant, what percent were white, MENA, and other race in particular? Next slide, please. So still on the question, does more accurate equal accurate, the presentation makes the following claim. We're confident changes in diversity measures reflect actual demographic changes. And here, maybe I'm being too literal and nitpicking on the wording actual demographic changes, but there are some changes in 2020 that seem to be more than about actual demographic change. And in particular, does that confidence that these reflect actual changes also apply to the increase in the multiracial population count from 9 million to 33.8 million? I ask about that particular change because it's a bit head-scratching to think that there are 24.8 million newly multiracial Americans between 2010 and 2020, when the total U.S. population count only grew by 23 million between those two decennial censuses. So some of that 24.8 million increase is, of course, newly multiracial Americans, but I have to think that much of it also has to be changes in how people identify, given changes to the question and how it is being coded. And I'm reminded here of the really remarkable increase in Americans who identified as American Indian, Native American, from about 500,000 in 1960 to nearly 3 million in the alone category by 2010, and over 8 million in the alone and combined category by 2010. So I would propose that changes in from 2010 reflect both actual demographic change and changes resulting from changes in question wording, such as more right-end response examples, such as more right-end response areas, more and different examples of ethnicity and race categories, as well as changes in response codes. If we accept that as a fair way to think about what has changed since 2010, it also begs the question about how we should think about other counts from 2020. And here, one that's of particular interest to me because it was in so many headlines is the finding that the population count of white Americans for the first time in a decennial census declined between 2010 and 2020. And one possible implication here that the 2000 counts reflect both demographics change actually and changes in survey context and coding is to ask, could it be that the decline in the U.S. white population is actually more of a lower bound estimate of the decline? And my specific reason for asking that is that you could ask the counterfactual question, how much larger might that decline have looked like if examples for white identity were not included in 2020, or more to the point, if there had been a separate Middle East, North Africa racial category as was planned at one point. Next slide, please. These are hopefully useful questions to raise in thinking about changes to the 2020 census and the question of accuracy. I want to now turn quickly to the third question, is self-administered the same as self-identified? And what I mean by this is that sometimes only one person fills out the census for only one person, and in that case there's no problem, but sometimes one person fills out the census for multiple people in their household. And for the latter case, if changes from 2010 reflect both actual demographic change and changes in survey context, it begs the question of who is answering the ethnicity and race questions, and how those responses might have differed if somebody else in a household were filling out the census for the household. Self-administered is only the same as self-identified if there is an underlying objective true racial identity or ethnic identity that corresponds to a person's identity and background. And if that's the case, it really shouldn't matter who in the household is answering these questions. But as we all know, there's a wealth of research demonstrating that the same person might answer a question about their own racial and ethnic identity differently, depending on how the question is asked, depending on where the question is asked, workplace versus home. And as mentioned earlier, there continue to be many Americans, even in the 2020 improved version of the race and ethnicity question, who just aren't clear how to answer the questions because it does not match their understanding of their own background. This possibility of contingency and error in answering these questions might be visible in differences between mode of administration, especially between online and an interactive mode like in-person or phone. And we might see this especially in the frequency of identifying with the residual category of other race, or in identifying with two or more races. So a couple of possible ways to assess data quality issues stemming from this question might be to examine whether there are differences in the likelihood of selecting other race or two or more races by mode. Or I don't know if the census might collect paradata for synchronous modes of participation like phone or in-person interviews on who in the household is actually giving the information to the entire household. And this might not be the right way to think about it, and others on NAC probably have better ideas about how to get at the question, but I think it's an important question. Okay, last slide, please. So those are my remarks in the presentation. My main point has been that whereas the presentation summary is that changes from the 2010 census race and ethnicity questions result in a more accurate portrait of how people self-identify, I would suggest that changes from 2010 reflect both accurate and actual demographic change in the ethnic and racial composition of the United States, and changes resulting from changes in question wording and response codes. If that alternate summary, one that takes into account the psychology of survey response, is right, then I think it is critical that the Census Bureau consider both sources of change as it continues to release data products from the 2020 census and going forward, as it researches and deliberates on potential new OMB standards for 2020 and what those revised standards might yield vis-a-vis both sources of change in future decennial census counts. Finally, and as always, I really appreciate the care and attention the Census Bureau gives to some very difficult and delicate issues with respect to how best to capture the nation's changing diversity, and hope that NAC can continue to offer our input and recommendations on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Seiko. It was a really detailed and thorough presentation that will allow us to actually take Professor Lichter by proxy out of the queue. So we've got about 6 minutes left. We're going to go with Interdeep, then Karthik, and then if we have time, I just have a quick question myself. So Interdeep, please. I think you're muted. You're still muted. If you want, I can read the question out of the chat for you. Okay. So Interdeep asked, the enhancements in capturing and coding at the micro level is impressive. Just wondering if and how the micro level data are used by agencies and groups.
Thanks, James. I can take that question. I'll say that in the next session, we're going to talk about the need for detailed disaggregated data, and I think that would be a great topic to bring up there. We're looking for feedback from the public about the use cases for those data. If I could for a second, I want to acknowledge all the great questions that Teku mentioned before you go into the question from Karthik. So many of these questions are addressed in the way that we wrote the America Counts stories by talking about the improvements and the design changes that we made. We say that it's a more accurate portrait than what we measured in 2010. We also acknowledged in the reports and in our discussions with the public that we know that there would be a more accurate way to collect these data, which reflects how people are self-identifying, which would be to use the combined question with multiple detailed checkboxes. So there were purposeful words in the ways that we presented these reports and talked about comparisons to the past. We want to make sure that the public understands and researchers understand the way in which the data was collected and coded and tabulated has improved, but we also still recognize some of the challenges with the ways in which these questions may not reflect the ways that people are self-identifying. We've brought in the information about what we've learned over the past decade to make those comparisons and talk about how we're not surprised, for example, that some of the race is the second largest group, and we acknowledge that meant for it to be as a residual category, it's definitely telling us something when you have 15% of the population reporting as some other race. So I just want to thank you for your comments and encourage everyone to recognize that we will be working with our advisory groups, with the public, with other stakeholders as we go into thinking about what do we learn from 2020 and how does that help us move forward to get more accurate measurements. Jim, back to you.
So I'm sorry, I'm on now. So James, can I just add one thing to the question that I asked?
Yes, please.
In terms of collecting, capturing, and reporting data at these levels, which agencies or groups use it, specifically because reporting obligations for most of the federal and state reporting, OMB categories are used. So when we report on our populations, whether it's workforce or otherwise, we just are asked to report on those OMB categories. So I was just wondering how the other data or the micro-level data are used. Thank you.
I can address that for a quick second. To confirm it, many times people may not report the major overall group, but reporting those detailed groups helps us to more accurately define where we're placing that response. So someone may not identify as Black or African American, but they may report something like Jamaican or Haitian that we then classify as Black or African American following the standards. So often, as we've seen in our research, people may not identify with that larger OMB category, but they're reporting these many nuanced and diverse responses that we code and classify according to the OMB standards.
No, I understand that. By reporting, I meant was, for example, when we are asked to report to the federal government, what our workforces look like, we just asked to report in those OMB categories. So that's why I raised the usefulness of the detail or the micro-level data. I wish the agencies and the reporting obligations expanded the way they ask us to report the data, but they're still using the OMB categories. So I was just wondering, and like you said, in the next presentation, it should be, they'd sort of talk about how the data are used. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we just have a minute left. I'll actually put my question in the form of a recommendation, and the last discussant will be Karthik for this.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, my question was something that Teku had flagged. I'm wondering if the Census Bureau either has conducted this analysis or plans to conduct an analysis looking at those individuals, say adults, that self-reported on race and ethnicity in 2010 and also self-reported on race and ethnicity in 2020 to see how much of that change over time may be attributable to the change in the format. Now, we know it's a little bit more complicated than that because past studies have also shown instability over between 2000 to 2010, even when the questions were largely the same. And so that's the first part of my question is there any kind of individual level analysis that's been done, or are there any plans to do so? And the second question related to that is, what should we make about stability? I mean, yes, we can say it's accurate, but it's still a snapshot in time, and those same individuals in a future ACS might write in different categories. So any thoughts about any analysis that the Census Bureau can do to continue to update the public on both of these issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. Great questions, great comments and suggestions. That's part of what we're thinking about as we learn what we've seen in 2020. How does it compare to the past? But one of the limitations with comparing to the past is that we didn't see all of that information in 2010 or earlier censuses. We didn't elicit detailed white responses. We didn't elicit detailed black responses. We didn't code more than 2 groups per write-in line. We didn't see more than 30 characters per write-in line. But in our research over the past decade, we saw that people were reporting much more detailed responses, many longer responses than ever before. And so that's why we made those changes to hopefully get a more accurate portrait here in 2020. Compared to the past is not something that's always apples to apples, and that's not just 2010 to 2020. This is throughout the nation's history. We've worked to continue to improve the questions that we're asking so that we can continue to follow and move forward with how we're more accurately reporting the population. But like you said, it's a snapshot. We can learn from 2020. We also see that we can make improvements, and that's what we look forward to talking with you and others about as we continue to go forward over the next several years.
So I just want to thank Nicholas, Roberto, Eric, and Teku for a really great discussion and presentations. And with that, we're going to turn it back over to Karen for the next panel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again to our great presenters and great discussion. We really appreciate that feedback. So now we're going to turn to the next presentation, and we will hear from Jason Devine and Cynthia Hollingsworth, who will present on a status update regarding the 2020 Census data products and stakeholder engagement plans. And following that, we will hear from Nicholas Jones again, who will talk about the proposed 2020 Census data products for detailed racial and ethnic groups. And this will be followed by discussants Thomas Lyons and committee discussion. So thank you, Jason and Cynthia. Take it away.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Karen. I'm Jason Devine. I work within the Population Division of the Census Bureau. Thank you for the opportunity to provide you with an update on the 2020 Census data products and our stakeholder engagement plans today. I will start by providing some basic background information to help with the discussion, and then my colleague, Cynthia Davis Hollingsworth from the Decennial Census Management Division, will go over the timeline and stakeholder engagement plans. And then, as Karen said, we will turn it back over to Nicholas, who will provide additional information on the 2020 data products for detailed race and detailed ethnic groups. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll start with some background. So the 2020 Census Apportionment and Redistricting data, as we all know, has been released. The timeline for the development and release of the Demographic and Housing Characteristics File, or the DHC, was impacted by splitting the development of the Disclosure Avoidance System or the redistricting data from the Disclosure Avoidance System for the DHC. And that's kind of an important point for understanding why we're focusing our attention on this work now and why work hasn't been done on this front up to this point. As we work to meet the deadlines for the redistricting data, we focus our attention on developing the Disclosure Avoidance System for that product. And in doing that, we split the Disclosure Avoidance System that would support that product and between the redistricting data and the DHC data. So the timelines for the DHC and detailed DHC will include both making decisions about demographic and geographic detail and the development and tuning of the Disclosure Avoidance System to support those products. Use cases and data accuracy will be considered in decisions about the demographic and geographic detail that will be included in the DHC and detailed DHC. And a point that we get a lot of questions about, consistency between the redistricting and DHC data continues to be included in the design of the disclosure avoidance system that will support the DHC product. Even though both approaches will be based on differential privacy, the DHC and detailed DHC will be protected using different sets of algorithms. And the 2020 Census Data Product Planning Crosswalk provides key information or important information on the tables that are currently planned for inclusion in the DHC and detailed DHC. Next slide, please. So there's some potential changes we want to bring to your attention that are under consideration for the DHC file. We're considering limiting the DHC tables to census tracts and above, considering producing the protected DHC tables directly without producing the underlying protected microdata. And I'll mention here the design of the detailed DHC already does not include the production of microdata. And we're looking at revisiting the timing of the release of the demographic profile relative to the DHC and the contents of the demographic profile. This decade is a little different than last decade, where we were able to produce the demographic profile shortly after the release of the redistricting data and get that out to local communities who were waiting for census data, wanted to get it as soon as possible. The timing is a little different this decade, where it's going to be a little longer period between the release of the redistricting data and either the demographic profile or the DHC. So we're reconsidering that. And I'll go into a little bit detail about each of these products over the next few slides. And the first few items in this bullet would be done with the idea of being, by taking these steps, we may be able to release the data sooner, and we may be able to have more accurate data as part of this effort. Next slide, please. So there are some implications of benefits of producing the protected DHC tables directly without the underlying protected microdata. And I wanted to go through some of these because we often get questions about this. It would mean potentially increased accuracy in the DHC tables, and it may allow for the release of the DHC data sooner. Demonstration products would be in the form of tables instead of privacy-protected microfiles. So those of you who are familiar with the work on the disclosure avoidance system to support the redistricting product, we released a series of demonstration products based on 2010 data that allowed people to see the accuracy we were able to achieve. And we plan on doing the same thing for the DHC tables and disclosure avoidance system. But if we move to not producing the underlying microdata, these demonstration products would be in the form of tables instead of microdata files. And taking this step may potentially lead to less or no accuracy within the DHC tables, and also potentially less or no consistency between the redistricting data and the DHC tables. And because we wouldn't be producing that underlying microdata as part of this initial effort, it may impact the availability of the DHC data in other products, such as a PUMS file or special tabulations. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through the key products we're talking about just so you have an understanding of what's included in each of these. And I'll start with the redistricting file, which of course has already been released. So this directs, Public Law 94-171 directs the Bureau to provide data to governors and legislative leaderships in each of the 50 states for redistricting purposes. And this was the first file released that included demographic and housing characteristics about detailed geographic areas. Subjects were somewhat limited, but they included voting age, race, Hispanic or Latino origin, occupancy status, group quarters population by major group quarters type, and all of these tables were released down to the census block level and for levels above that geography, and it was released on August 12th. So these data are already available. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the demographic profile before talking about the DHC, but keep in mind that the demographic profile really is just a subset of tables that would be available in the DHC. This product is produced to provide critical demographic and housing characteristics about local communities in an easy-to-use format as soon after the release of the redistricting product as possible. And as I mentioned, we are looking at reconsidering the timing of the release of this product this decade. Subjects, again, are a subset of tables included in the DHC, and at this point we're proposing to include data on 5-year age groups, sex, race, Hispanic or Latino origin, household type, relationship to householder, group quarters population, and housing occupancy and housing tenure. And these would be made available at the place and minor civil division level and other geographies that are either at or above that level of geography. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the demographic and housing characteristics file, the DHC. The DHC will include many of the demographic and housing tables previously included in Summary File 1. Subjects will include age, sex, race, Hispanic or Latino origin, household type, family type, relationship to householder, and here some subjects will be provided for major OMB race and ethnicity groups, tables for the group quarters population, housing occupancy, and housing tenure. And with the DHC, for many of these tables, we're proposing to release them at the census block level, and of course, geographic levels above the block level. What the DHC will not include, though, are those tables that provide counts by detailed race, Hispanic origin, tribes, and population counts by household family types, and we typically describe some of these tables as tables that require household person joins. Next slide, please. I'm going to go over the detailed demographic and housing characteristics file quickly because Nicholas is going to go into more detail about this, but the detailed DHC would include tables iterated by detailed race, ethnicity, and American Indian Alaska Native tribes and villages. These were tables that were included in 2010 in Summary File 2 and the American Indian Alaska Native Summary File. And it will also include some of the complex person and household join tables from 2010 that were in Summary File 1 that were not included in the DHC. Subjects will include, and the asterisk means it's iterated by detailed race and ethnicity and American Indian Alaska Native groups, total population, sex by age for selected age categories, household type, housing tenure, average household and family size, population by family type and tenure, population by household type and relationship, own children by family type, and average household size by tenure. And the geography will vary, with many tables proposed at the county level and for American Indian Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian areas. Next slide, please. So that completes my segment of the presentation. I will now hand it over to Cynthia.
Okay. Thanks, Jason. So I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the importance of stakeholder engagement and walk through our current engagement plan for finalizing the DHC. So as we learned, the process of producing the redistricting data over the past year has really been informative to us. It's highlighted how critical data user and stakeholder engagement is to the process. Specifically, there were two major lessons that we learned from this activity. One is that the successful engagement requires both teaching and learning. We've been educating our stakeholders and data users every step of the way about what differential privacy is, why we've adopted it, and how the implementation of the DAS's top-down algorithm works. We've presented at various conferences, meetings, we've released videos, blogs, newsletters, technical papers. We've conducted webinars, as well as redesigning our web pages to access this information. In fact, I'm very happy to announce that this week we released our first differential privacy handbook entitled Disclosure Avoidance for the 2020 Census, an Introduction. We released that on Tuesday. It was developed in partnership with the Population Reference Bureau, and our hope is that the stakeholder and data user community finds this handbook helpful in understanding how we implemented differential privacy to the 2020 census, specifically as it relates to the redistricting data. However, I want to circle back to how we define the successful engagement and the point I was trying to make. As part of the education process, we also have to take a step back and acknowledge, in order to successfully implement the TDA, or the top-down algorithm, that required us to educate ourselves about how the data are being used and for what purposes. This involved interacting with the data user and stakeholder community, such as yourselves, to gather that critical feedback. The second big lesson learned was the importance of producing demonstration data as well as metrics to allow for independent assessments of the data's fitness for use. Meaning, we ran the 2010 census data through the 2020 disclosure avoidance system, the top-down algorithm, to produce statistics that were comparable to the published 2010 census tabulations. This provided a way for independent analyses about how effective the DAS's TDA was at preserving the data's usefulness for various purposes. And because we felt that was such a success for the demographic and housing characteristics file, we plan to use a similar process. That is, we'll continue our education efforts, we'll gather feedback from and listen to the data user community, and we'll demonstrate how we might implement the disclosure avoidance for these data. Noting that the first of these data user feedback activities is the crosswalk review that we have been talking about, where we released the crosswalk in mid-September. Towards the end of this presentation, I will circle back to Jason where he would give a summary of the feedback we've received to date on the crosswalk. Next slide, please. So the next two slides that I'll go through will outline the activities within the next year for completing the DHC development and moving us into production. I want you to keep in mind that this is a notional timeline, so it should be used as a guide. That is, dates are now final, and these processes will be refined as we move through the process. Throughout, however, feedback from the stakeholder and data user community, such as this group, is going to be absolutely critical. As shown on the slide, now through this fall, we've been collecting and have begun assessing the feedback on the potential changes to the DHC tables. For example, as Jason discussed, that perhaps we would drop some of the currently proposed block level or block group level tabulations to improve accuracy for track level and above tabulations. So again, gathering this feedback and understanding the uses is really important for us to move into the configuration and testing phase of the DAS. So as we confirm these use cases, that will move us into developing demonstration data sometime later this or in the winter 2021, early 2022, where we would then release the demonstration data for evaluation. As shown on this slide and the next slide, I just want to point out that after each feedback loop, we will stop, reassess, determine what needs to change, and communicate the status to ensure we continue to be transparent about our processes. Next slide, please. So in the spring of 2022, after we've released the first set of demonstration data and have received the feedback, this will allow us for the data users to provide us with their analysis of fitness for use. We'll continue tuning the algorithm and will then produce a second set of demonstration data. Our expectations are with this release, we would also conduct a public workshop similar to the one we conducted in December of 2019. This workshop will allow both internal and external data users to present their analyses and assessments of fitness for use. This, again, is that critical feedback loop for us as we move toward setting the final parameters for the top-down algorithm. That is, this feedback will help inform the Census Bureau's Data Stewardship and Executive Policy Committee, or DSEP, for when they make the final decisions about the privacy loss budget to be assigned for the production run of the DHC and how that privacy loss budget should be allocated across the various components of the data. Then in the next summer, the actual production run of the DHC is expected to begin, and that is producing the privacy-protected microdata file, right now, as we've defined it, that will be used to tabulate the data products. I want to note and caution that this date does not entail the activities of tabulating, reviewing, and disseminating the data to the public. Therefore, this timeline is not reflective of the actual data release. We continue to work that part of the schedule out, and once we finalize that, we will notify the public. Next slide, please. And this slide is just a graphical representation of the timeline I just walked through. And in fact, we've actually been highlighting this particular graphic on our website, so I'm sure you've seen it before. I do want to point out, as shown on the graphic, the D-step decision points for assigning the privacy loss budget for both demonstration data products as well as the production run. Next slide, please. So I will turn it back over to Jason to walk through the crosswalk, how you can access it if you haven't already, and then to give you a summary of around the feedback we've received to date. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you, Cynthia. The previous slide did show where on our website you could find the crosswalk. We've done in different venues, demonstrations, and walkthroughs of the crosswalk. We do have a webinar where we walked through the crosswalk and showed people how to use it and the information that was included in it. And I think the easiest way to find the crosswalk would be just to go to our webpage and put in disclosure avoidance in the search bar, and it will take you to the disclosure avoidance modernization page, and that's where you'll find a lot of other information about this effort, as well as a link to the crosswalk. Next slide, please. So we are pleased with the comments we received. We've received 360 comments by the due date of October 22nd that we established for the DHC tables. And the first look at these shows that at least 175 of them include specific use case and data needs. We have received comments that document legal or strong community needs for census data at low geographic levels. And an initial review of the comments shows some common needs include age data by race for developing estimates and projections and planning purposes, housing counts by characteristics of the household or family for assistance programs and emergency planning. And we are in the process of reviewing the comments received, and this is actually, we're spending quite a bit of time to go through each of these comments to make sure we give them the attention we think they deserve. We've actually received substantial comments from a number of people, and this effort includes looking at those comments. In some cases, they've been very specific and have given us specific tables and geographies of which they need the data for. In other cases, they've just outlined their need, their use case, and have mentioned the topics they're interested in. So we're going back through and trying to link those up with the tables that would meet those needs to see if as the DHC, the contents of the DHC are proposed now in the crosswalk file, if they meet those needs, or if we have to consider changes to what we're proposing in the crosswalk files if we're going to want to meet those needs. And we're still requesting comments on the detailed DHC table, which Nicholas is going to talk about next. Thank you. I think that concludes our section of the presentation, Cynthia, and we'll now turn it over to Nicholas.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Cynthia. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks for confirming. I'm pleased to be able to talk with you all again today, this time focusing on the Census Bureau's work to develop 2020 census data products for detailed racial and ethnic groups and American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages. Last year, researchers in our Demographic Directorate worked with our colleagues in the Research and Methodology Directorate and the Decennial Directorate to explore ways to balance the need for accurate statistics with the requirements of differential privacy to produce 2020 census data for detailed race and ethnicity groups and their demographic characteristics from the 2020 decennial census. As we've discussed, this constrained by the need for new differential privacy measures and balancing expectations of policies and programs and data users and the public to produce accurate decennial census statistics for very small population groups, Census Bureau leaders and researchers have been working on the mechanism to produce a meaningful compromise to enable the production of 2020 census population counts and statistics for detailed race, ethnicity, and tribal populations. This fall, we began public engagement about the goals for the detailed DHC and to obtain feedback about producing these important data from the decennial census. If you turn to the next slide, please. Just want to provide a little background. As you know, the Census Bureau has a long history of tabulating statistics for detailed race and ethnicity groups and protecting information provided by respondents. Over the decades, more and more granular census data have been published. Advances in data science and more powerful computing and externally accessible big data has increased the risk of identifying individuals from published statistics. So to mitigate the risk, the Census Bureau is implementing new disclosure avoidance measures for the 2020 census. For the detailed DHC data product, we're developing proposals with a differentially private disclosure avoidance system with experts from a company called Tumult Labs. The main reason we had to develop a system that was separate from the designs that we used for the public law file are that the restraints for these products that statistics be tabulated from microdata and that it be operated on the cells of a publication were simply unviable for the detailed race ethnicity data product. Those requirements are completely broken when we have to produce data for thousands of detailed population groups. So we relaxed the requirements, and the biggest need was for our subject matter experts to examine the use cases and consider the privacy and accuracy balance to find ways to produce detailed statistics needed with these hard trade-offs. On the next slide, just want to go back over that we refer to the 2020 census data product as detailed DHC data product. This includes tables on detailed racial populations, detailed Hispanic populations, and specific American Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages, as well as their basic demographic and housing characteristics for these groups from the census: sex, age, household, family type, and tenure. Public feedback combined with the Census Bureau's review of table access rates, subject matter knowledge, and the informed advice from the public helped us to design a proposal for the development of the detailed DHC. Our proposal for producing 2020 census data for these population counts and characteristics focuses on tables that have been developed in an attempt to balance the programmatic and the legal and the statistical needs of data users in the public and the requirements of differential privacy. From the 2020 census results, we're planning to produce data for more detailed race groups than ever before, but at many fewer geographic levels, as well as fewer and less detailed tables to balance accuracy and privacy. The next slide, please. I have a little timeline for the development of this detailed DHC product. In the spring of 2020, our demo team was introduced to Group 2 differential privacy work and a team of researchers from Tumult Labs. We worked with Tumult for several months to develop analytical tools for evaluating privacy and accuracy as a balance for producing detailed statistics. Throughout last summer in 2020 and into the fall, demo researchers evaluated data from the 2010 census to explore how best to achieve a balance of privacy and accuracy for detailed statistics and characteristics of sex by age for these race ethnicity groups. In the fall of 2020, demo presented a proposal and recommendations to Census Bureau leadership for producing total detailed racial and ethnic group population counts and sex by age statistics. Census Bureau leadership provided initial approval for the demo parameters and epsilon levels that we presented, and throughout the winter and summer of 2021, Census Bureau demo researchers pivoted to work on the critical 2020 census data files for producing apportionment and redistricting data products, and we've regrouped onto this work for detailed DHC in the summer of 2021. Next slide, please. I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that the demo researchers did with Tumult Lab experts last year. We utilized a Tumult Labs tool called SafeTech. This allows us to assess the interaction and the balance of privacy and accuracy for producing detailed race and ethnicity data from the 2020 census. The research explored ways in which privacy and accuracy levels could be set to produce statistics on thousands of detailed racial and ethnic groups, which vary in size, geographic distribution, and in characteristics for basic demographics such as sex and age. SafeText is an Excel spreadsheet which relies on mathematical formulas and publicly available 2010 detailed race ethnicity data to approximate the differential privacy algorithm that could be used for 2020. The analyst uses key parameters such as total epsilon, relative error, levels of geography, and the SafeTech tool produces an approximate tally of the data that could be produced. Essentially, the tool answers the question, given specific parameter settings, such as the total epsilon of 10, 4 geographic levels being specified, 2 iteration levels for detailed groups, etc., what data could be published within an acceptable level of accuracy. This research enabled demo to develop recommendations to determine SafeTech parameter settings for acceptable statistics to be used in the final algorithm to produce differentially private 2020 census detailed race, ethnicity, age, and sex data. On the next slide, just want to give you a little reminder of what we talked about in the previous session, and that was a sense of the volume of data that we're talking about. There's a link on the slide to our 2020 Census State Redistricting Data Public Law Summary file for the technical documentation that shows our 2020 Census Race Ethnicity Code List. If you're not familiar with it, it's part of Appendix F in our technical documentation, and it provides a catalog of the thousands of unique racial and ethnic groups and the American Indian, Alaska Native tribes and villages that are represented in the United States population. We talked about the 350 million unique write-ins. This is a group of codes and classifications that will help you understand more about that volume. There's a mix of regional groups such as European, and then detailed groups listed under that such as Albanian and Alsatian and Armenian. The list runs alphabetically from A to Z for each of the major race ethnicity categories, and it is dozens and dozens of pages long. Over the past decade, Census Bureau leaders conducted extensive outreach and engagement with communities across the country to discuss their data needs, and our research showed that we wanted to enable the collection of detailed responses for all population groups in the United States. And we understand why these statistics are critical for communities and programs and policies and laws. No data collection other than the decennial census has the power and the breadth and the depth to collect and produce these statistics for all detailed racial and ethnic groups in the United States. Our highest priority is to provide the most accurate data possible for the critical statistics that are needed by small, detailed population groups, such as American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages, as we know these data are not available elsewhere other than the decennial census. Next slide, please. So to illustrate the race and ethnicity categories and their particular scope related to the detailed population group data tables, we analyzed the detailed population groups for each major category and how their size estimates from 2010 census data and or recent American Community Survey data differ across groups. We know that the number of groups, the size of groups, vary across federal categories. Just here from left to right across, the bars show in green Hispanic origin detailed groups, red shows detailed Asian groups, blue shows detailed Black or African American groups. Pacific Islander detailed groups are shown in yellow, Middle Eastern or North African groups in dark orange, and European groups in light orange. If certain thresholds are applied to the production of detailed statistics, some groups will be more impacted than others. You may have noticed that this figure does not include a listing of American Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and Central and South American indigenous groups. This is purposeful, as you'll see on the next slide, because the list is simply too long to display in the same table format alongside the other race and ethnicity categories. And this is an important reality for us to be conscious of and to factor in as we make decisions about the decennial census data products. On the next slide, to underscore this point, we created a table listing the detailed American Indian tribes and Alaska Native village groups from the 2010 census and their population sizes. The graphic contextualizes the uniqueness of the AIN population in the United States. There are thousands of detailed tribes, villages, and indigenous groups for which the U.S. decennial census has historically produced data. A key dimension for AIN tribes and villages is their federally recognized status. In the 2010 census, the Census Bureau produced population counts for all federally recognized tribes in the United States, as well as state-recognized tribes and Central and South American indigenous groups, including those with population counts less than 10, counts of 0, 1, or 2. The data visualization highlights federally recognized American Indian tribes in dark purple and non-federally American Indian tribes in white. Federally recognized Alaska Native villages are also highlighted in dark purple and non-federally recognized Alaska Native villages in light purple. These groups are much smaller in size than the comparable detailed groups for the white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, or even Pacific Islander populations. And therefore, we developed a different data visualization for us to understand the impact on AIN tribes and villages, their number, and their size. Establishing population thresholds at various levels disproportionately would impact AIN detailed groups. And this visualization you'll see in the next slide. Here, this perspective helps us to understand how all this fits together. In previous censuses, a minimum population threshold was used to protect privacy for data. For example, in 2010, a threshold of 100 people was in place for producing detailed population counts. Our research pinpoints an impact of establishing thresholds and how it would have adverse impacts on different population groups and statistics for federal, programmatic, and legislative uses. The table compares the number of detailed groups in each major race ethnicity category at various population levels and enables us to see the impact that establishing thresholds would have on different population groups, especially those for which the Census Bureau has historically tabulated statistics. The table shows that the AIN population would be immediately and disproportionately impacted with the threshold of 100 in place at the national level. Nearly 500 AIN tribes, villages, and groups would not receive any data if we establish a threshold of 100 for decennial census products. In previous decennial censuses, we created special AIN data products to provide a basic population count for all tribes, villages, and indigenous groups in the U.S. at the national, regional, division, and state geographic levels. These data are critical and important to AIN tribes and villages, and not having these statistics would have real-world impacts on AIN tribes and villages who rely on the data. The table here also shows that Pacific Islander populations will be impacted with certain population thresholds in place. There may be only about 20 detailed NHPI groups, but half of these groups would not receive data with a threshold of 500 at the national level. While the Hispanic population also has about 20 detailed groups, the population would not be impacted until the threshold reached over 20,000 at the national level. The Asian population, with about 24 detailed groups, would have a relatively small impact of 2 detailed groups not meeting the 100 threshold and 4 not meeting a 5,000 threshold. Looking at previous data collections with about 63 detailed Black groups, we would not receive data for thresholds of about 100 to 500. However, close to about half of the groups would lose it at a threshold of 5,000. Only about 3 of the detailed white groups would not receive data with a threshold of 500, or about 15 at the threshold of 5,000 at the national level. Again, this is just meant to give you a sense of perspective based on previous census results for detailed groups. On the next slide, we'll talk about our challenge for the 2020 Census Detailed DHC Data Product Proposal, which was to find a compromise to meet the needs of data users while implementing the new disclosure avoidance method for privacy. To do so, we examined the interplay of different parameter settings for the algorithm to produce these differentially private 2020 census data with detailed race and ethnicity groups and their sex and age characteristics. This research is specific to total population counts and characteristics of sex and age for these groups. We're currently evaluating other statistics that were produced in 2010, such as tenure, household type, family type, with our colleagues and experts in the other parts of Demo Directorate. Demo's highest priority is to provide the most accurate statistics for the critical data needs, especially knowing these statistics are not available elsewhere. Our research goals were to explore how privacy and accuracy levels could be established to produce statistics for our nation's myriad population groups. We also wanted to find ways to allow for equity across all major race and ethnicity categories, and to strive to provide the same amount or more data than provided from the 2010 census. So, how do we find ways to balance privacy and accuracy? Well, on the next slide, we have a visual that we made that just helps us understand what we're thinking about in terms of balancing privacy and accuracy. I want you to imagine looking at this image that you had a stereo system with different levers and different buttons to tune the music level and get the best output of sound that you wanted to hear. That's effectively what we did with our research explorations and our work with remote labs, with sound being the output of the balance of privacy and accuracy. The parameters that you could tune are shown here on the slide with the bright green buttons and the levers. Turning the buttons on or off or moving the levers up or down impacted whether various geographic levels such as regions or divisions or states, places or counties will be included in the data output. Whether detailed population groups such as German or Mexican or Navajo will be included. Whether regional groupings such as South Asian, European, or Middle Eastern and North African could be included, as well as the interplay of margins of error, relative error, and levels of epsilon. Our research team tried out a number of different ways to visualize these impacts, and the way in which we understood and settled on was to think about the balance of the parameter tuner and the visualization of noise for the best way for us to understand how all of the parameter settings interact. and what this means for producing a balance of privacy and accuracy for producing detailed statistics. The next series of slides shows the 4 proposed detailed DHC data tables for the 2020 census in our current proposal. The first table, T1, would show population counts for detailed racial, ethnic, and AIN groups such as German, Nigerian, Vietnamese, Navajo Nation, or Samoan. All of the detailed groups that we talked about in terms of our data collections. On the next slide, we see a second proposed table, T2, which would provide sex by age statistics for the detailed race and ethnicity and AIN groups that are part of the data product. The third table on the next slide, T3, would be proposed to show household statistics and family statistics for detailed race and ethnicity and AIN groups, such as married couple families or householders living alone. On the next slide, the fourth table, T4, would show tenure statistics, such as characteristics of owners and renters for detailed racial, ethnic, and AIN Alaska Native populations. Finally, with the next slide to provide additional context, I want to talk about how we consider these data products in comparison to the scope and depth of data products from the 2010 census. In comparison to 2010 census tables, the proposed 2020 census tables for this detailed DHC product would provide trade-offs. There will be fewer and less detailed population tables in 2020, 4 versus 57. There will be far fewer geographic levels available for the tabulations in 2020, 4 versus 104. There will be higher thresholds for producing a sex by age table, for example, a threshold of 100 versus 500 at the national level. While there will be similar numbers of detailed American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages eligible for tabulation in 2020, around 1,200, there would be higher thresholds for producing these counts for AIN tribes. There was no threshold in place in 2010 AIN pop counts, but from our 2020 research, we're proposing a threshold of 10 for AIN population counts, resulting in about 200 AIN groups not receiving a total measure in 2020. On the other hand, for 2020 census, we will produce more national and state total counts for detailed racial and ethnic population groups than ever before, with a threshold of 10 in place in 2020 versus 100 in 2010. In addition to the data for hundreds of AIN tribes, we would have a larger number of detailed race and ethnicity groups, especially through the collection and the expansion of our work to collect detailed data since 2010. Additionally, the 2020 census would have a rigorous privacy guarantee, and we want to ensure that the public understands that this proposal for 2020 census detailed data products is very different from previous census data products like 2010. There were many 2010 tables that we did not receive use cases for to retain. Other tables are produced elsewhere in the 2020 DHC data products, and there are also tables such as allocation rates that we're not able to produce because of differential privacy. In order to achieve this balance, we had to cut tables to end up with this proposal to get this amount of data. This is the trade-off with balancing for accuracy and privacy and where we need your feedback. Finally, on the last slide, I'll talk about conclusions here for the next steps with developing the detailed DHC. Where we are now in the fall of 2021, demo researchers have released the 2020 Public Law Redistricting Census results. And while we continue to engage with stakeholders and organizations and the media to analyze and discuss the 2020 results as we did earlier today, we're re-engaging with our colleagues in the Research and Methodology Directorate and Tumult Labs on the detailed DHC proposal and analysis. We're also beginning to engage with data users and the public on the detailed DHC proposal and to understand their use cases. These engagements will help us to evaluate the privacy and the accuracy trade-off for balancing the production of detailed DHC data. We want to advise the public that before final parameter settings and epsilon decisions are made for the detailed DHC, Census Bureau leaders must discuss the proposed 2020 census detailed data product plans with American Indian and Alaska Native tribal leaders. We'll do this in a formal AIN tribal consultation later this month on November 18th. And we also plan to address feedback and recommendations from the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee and the Census Scientific Advisory Committee. Additionally, demo researchers will need time to work with colleagues in the Center for Statistical Research and Methodology to assess the implications that post-processing would have on the production of these detailed statistics. Therefore, we want you to understand that final decisions on parameter settings in Epsilon cannot be made until all of these inputs play out. I hope that this presentation today has provided some insights to our explorations that we've done and the next steps for the 2020 Census Detailed DHC proposal. Again, our proposal for producing these critical statistics focuses on tables that have been developed in an attempt to balance the programmatic, legal, and statistical needs of data users and stakeholders and the requirements of differential privacy. As I said before, our highest priority is to produce the most accurate data possible for the critical statistics needed by many small detailed population groups, particularly American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages, knowing that these data are not available other than the decennial census. We look forward to your comments and your questions, and we've also posed 3 questions for the conversation starter for NAC on the next slide. First, what questions or concerns do you have about any potential changes to the DHC and or the detailed DHC? Second, are there any critical decennial census statistics that are not currently proposed in the 2020 Census Data Products crosswalk and or geographic detail levels that you require? Third, what levels of geography, for example, places or school districts, are needed for detailed race, ethnicity, population statistics, and for what purpose, policy, program, etc. On behalf of Jason and Cynthia, I want to thank you for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to your feedback and to your questions.
Thanks so much, Nicholas, Cynthia, and Jason. With that, we're going to turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Jason, Cynthia, and Nicholas, for your presentations. Obviously, the issue of the new disclosure avoidance system and differential privacy is extremely complicated, so I certainly appreciate the clarity of your presentations, though they often raise more questions than they answer, just because of the nature of what we're doing. So I do want to start by recognizing, first of all, reiterating what Nicholas said several times, that we all have to recognize that any disclosure avoidance system is a balance between accuracy and privacy or confidentiality. And that means a couple of things. It means, first of all, that no matter what, there cannot be total transparency about the application of the DAS. There is going to be a black box element to this, and that's necessary to ensure the protection of privacy. Second, I do want to note that this is all going on as it did with the PL 94-171 file. This is all going on and being developed as we go. So I think it's fair to characterize the way the new DAS has been developed and is being developed as meeting the cliche of building the plane as you fly it. And we're all sort of stuck in that position. And the final thing I just want to note before I go into more detailed comments is that there is a risk management element to all of this, of course. When you sacrifice accuracy in order to create greater confidentiality, the sacrifice of accuracy has impacts for certain folks. That may be states, that may be localities, and those are the folks who then choose or may choose to engage in litigation or other challenges to those accuracy losses when they are revealed. So after those 3, I want to note that, of course, we're going into this development of the new DAS for the DHC and the DDHC following its development for the redistricting data. But point out that, of course, we are looking at something much more complex when you're talking about the DHC and the DDHC. Among the differences, obviously a much larger scope of potential uses for DHC and DDHC data. The redistricting data, as the name implies, primary use is in redistricting. That also means that the universe of stakeholders or data users is potentially much, much broader with respect to DHC and DDHC than with respect to the redistricting data. Obviously, as all of you have presented, the breadth of data points involved in these DHC and DDHC releases is much greater than it was with respect to the redistricting data, which basically focused on total population, voting age, and race ethnicity alone. Of course, as you've also seen in these presentations, the level of geographic detail differs product to product, and that is in contrast to the redistricting data that was provided at block level. And finally, of course, the number of product releases here is more expansive, even as restricted, as Nicholas explained, more expansive than what occurred with the release one day, one time in August of the redistricting data. So there are more challenges with respect to the further development of the DOS with respect to the DHC and the DDHC. It's therefore important, in my view, that as much as possible, both the Bureau and the NAC have further conversation about what has been learned, even though it was very recent, in the analysis and stakeholder engagement with respect to the PL 94-171 release. Specifically, there are three groups that I think it would really help us to have further conversation and evaluation of how that process went with respect to the redistricting data. So the first group, of course, are the stakeholders themselves. With respect to redistricting, that's both potentially very broad and potentially very limited. It has an effect on everyone, but those who are informed and involved in the redistricting process may be much more limited. But I think we need to learn more and talk more about what was the evaluation of how the demonstration products that were ultimately produced, the timing in which they were produced, what the content of them was, and whether the feedback that they generated was particularly useful or not useful to the Bureau in making its ultimate decisions on DAS development with respect to the redistricting release. I think with respect to stakeholder engagement, we also should evaluate carefully the decision timeline that did change in positive ways and concerning ways, I would have to say, with respect to the redistricting data over the course of the months leading up to that release. And then I think there's a conversation to be had about, a more detailed conversation about what the feedback was that was received from stakeholders in the redistricting data DAS development, whether it was useful, whether the timing made it more or less useful, and whether it had the clarity that the Bureau needed to inform decisions about ultimately applying DAS to the redistricting data. The second set of engaged folks that I think it's worth talking about with respect to the redistricting data is the Congress itself. Obviously, the development of new DAS is in response to a Congressional directive in Title 13 that goes way, way back. So I think it's important to understand what engagement occurred with respect to the DAS development on redistricting data with leading Congress members who have jurisdiction over the issues involved in Title 13, what kind of education efforts were engaged with them, whether those were successful, and whether there was any feedback received from congressional sources with respect to DAS development on the redistricting data. The third sort of group of individuals are the general public. And here I'm not as informed as I should be about what kind of engagement with the general public about the new DAS occurred with respect to the redistricting file. Again, redistricting file is limited for those who are engaged and interested in many respects, so I don't know whether there was much done with respect to the general public. And obviously, to the extent the general public was educated and informed about the new DAS, it came in the context of great contention around the 2020 census that I referred to earlier this morning. We saw an unprecedented politicization of census data collection, again, not emanating from the Bureau, but the Bureau certainly has to operate in that context. There were heightened confidentiality concerns that began long before the collection of data for the decennial census. The baseline knowledge of the previous swapping methodology of DAS is quite limited in the general public. And I think we need to know if anything is available about post-knowledge after the redistricting data came out using the new differential privacy system. What is the level of public knowledge about that? That obviously has implications for how people view confidentiality protections in the future for census data collection, not just in the decennial, but in your collection throughout the decade. I think there are important lessons that we should discuss to the extent they have been gathered from a post-analysis of how stakeholder engagement and release and education of the new DAS with respect to the redistricting data went forward. I think there are a number of questions that would help us to have explained, even if they have been explained previously, but this is a complicated area, and we have some relatively new NAC members already, and shortly, as we've been informed, we'll have even more new NAC members will be expected to engage on issues related to the DAS and the DHC and DDHC throughout this calendar year, and it's important that they be at a level of base knowledge that I'm not sure is there yet. The specific questions that I had, I think it's worth getting a greater explanation, if possible, from one or more of you about the decision to split the DAS development between the redistricting data release and the DHC and DDHC. We've heard that explained. I think it would behoove us to hear more about why that decision was made and what its implications are beyond the fact that you are now starting, in essence, a new, though clearly linked to the redistricting decisions, that a new DAS development for the DHC and the DDHC. I think it's worth getting some clarity more about the initial decision to require consistency between the redistricting data and what is released in the DHC and the DDHC. Now, that was, as my understanding, a policy decision. I think it would be useful to understand again why that policy decision was made, when it was made, and whether it is being revisited, especially because we heard just now that there may be some decisions and considerations that are being considered right now that could result in some decoupling of the consistency between those two data releases. I think that there should be further discussion about how timing might move forward. Totally understand that what we got before us is really a intended timeline, but I think we need to understand how that timeline might change. We saw changes in the course of the DAS development for the redistricting data, and just understanding how the timing might change is important, I think, to the NAC. And I think it's worth a much more detailed discussion about what sacrifices in microdata availability are contemplated and how those have been, will be received by data users and stakeholders. The next set of questions that I had is, to what extent has the Bureau itself cataloged and collected the statutory, legally required uses of DHC and DDHC data? Does the Bureau have a catalog, for example, of all the different, I assume it does, but has it publicly released, has it shared those, all of the different funding formulas under federal statute that use DHC or DDHC data? And with that catalog, has the Bureau engaged in a review, its own review, even before going to stakeholders, of how the new DAS might affect any of those funding formulas? And if it has done such a review or will do such a review, will it then make recommendations to the Congress about adjustments to those statutorily required uses of DHC or DDHC data? I have a similar set of questions with respect to any state or local legally required uses of Census DHC or DDHC data. Has the Census Bureau surveyed states and localities that it worked with in the course of census data collection about what is on their statutes with respect to use of DDHC or DHC data, and looked at those and determined whether there is any further review necessary or recommendations to be made about those, how those might be revised in light of the accuracy sacrifice necessitated by the disclosure avoidance system. And finally, going back to what I had said previously, I am interested in further discussion about the Bureau's interactions with congressional decision makers about the set of issues raised by the new DAS. As I explained earlier, this has obviously been developed in response to an interpretation of a congressional directive in Title 13 that goes back many, many years. And I'm wondering to what extent the Bureau has engaged in discussion or will engage in discussion with congressional decision makers about how Title 13 overlays with the availability of third-party big data, which has raised the concerns that led to the new DAS. Have those discussions occurred, whether big data was contemplated when Title 13 was put in place, or whether Congress should reconsider the specific parameters of Title 13 as a result of the availability of third-party commercial big data? Whether there have been discussions with congressional decision makers about whether there are different privacy concerns that attach to different collected characteristics. Are there different privacy concerns attached to sex as opposed to other data points? Are there different privacy concerns attached to age as opposed to other data collection points? Same for race, ethnicity, subgroups of race and ethnicity that Nicholas, through his last two presentations, has given us great detail about. But basically a discussion with decision makers about whether the value of privacy confidentiality differs between data collection points by the Bureau. And finally, whether there has been discussion, goes along with what I just said with respect to funding formulas, about whether there should be any changes to congressionally defined data release mandates as a result of the application of this new DAS, to the extent, and I understand the extent to be significant, that it differs from the swapping methodology that was used in 2010. So I know there's a number of questions. Many of them are really questions for further discussion in future NAC forum, but that is my initial discussion. I know we have limited time, so Jim, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Tom. And I guess before we have one person in the queue, Karthik, but before we do that, I guess we'll just turn it back to you, Nicholas, Cynthia, and Jason, just to see if you have a preliminary reaction to Tom's comments. But the other thing I would suggest, and perhaps we'll put it in the form of a recommendation, is that this should probably be, Tom has some very detailed questions that I suspect are something we can't cover in just a couple of minutes, that we perhaps will want to add either to the special meeting that we may potentially have in February or at our spring meeting. So, Nicholas, I'll turn it back over to the three of you before we go to Karthik.
Thanks, Jim. I think your point was well taken. There are a lot of great questions there raised by Tom's discussion, and we're expecting just from experience that many of those may become recommendations from the National Advisory Committee, which we will address in detail. I think maybe the common theme is just listening and getting that feedback about the detailed DHC and the DHC from the NAC and getting your advice and your recommendations as we think about moving forward. Cynthia or Jason, do you want to add anything to that?
I think I would just say, yeah, excellent questions. I would love to engage in a discussion and trying to answer those questions now, but I think we are limited on time. I'm especially interested in more discussion about the cataloging of use cases, something we're going through now. And this is something that started in 2018 when we did an initial Federal Register notice trying to get feedback on this. And of course, we've all learned, I think, a lot about the methodology and about what it meant for data products. So, we're seeing now in the comments we've received kind of much more informed, I think, feedback, and that's not the fault of those who are providing comments. It was just that we've had several years and an experience with the redistricting product for people to see how this played out and to learn about this methodology. And then I'll leave it at that because I know we're limited on time, and maybe we can find a different way to provide responses to those excellent questions.
And just what I'll suggest before I turn it over to Karthik is that I believe we probably will put some of those in recommendations. I think one of the recommendations I think that would make a lot of sense is to add this to any special meeting we have specifically on the messaging for differential privacy, because I think given the importance of this topic, it's really important that we have this as a public discussion and not just a one-way briefing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Karthik.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, everyone. So I have three questions. One is, the first two are just kind of clarification questions, and I may have missed this. The first one is on the timing of when we expect some of these tables, and especially the ones that say at the county level, I think are going to be critical, especially for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities that have significant language needs. County hospitals rely on population estimates or counts of members of these detailed origin groups, in order to figure out what kind of language support they need to offer. Of course, they could rely on the ACS, but we're going to find out that there are going to be challenges with the most current data on the ACS in terms of its recency. But even for some of the smaller population areas, ACS 5-year files may not provide the kind of coverage that they need. So wondering what the timing that you anticipate for the release of the detailed origin data at the county level. Second, I just want to just make sure, Nicholas, that I'm understanding this right, that the drop in the number of population tables down to 4, I just want to, or maybe if you can just give further clarity on what those will be. I understand the geography kind of limitation given the number of categories, but I'd like to just get more clarity there. And then finally, specifically when it comes to Asian populations, one of my recommendations would be there's a growing sense in the community that, you have these categories of South Asian, Southeast Asian, and East Asian. And specifically with that other Asian category, when you have a miscellaneous category like that, it's not as helpful as if some of that data could be re-aggregated to those regional breakdowns. So wondering if that's on your radar at all, and if there's any hope for thinking about that kind of a reclassification and re-aggregation of the other Asian category in terms of the public report out.
Okay, thank you. This is Cynthia. I will take a stab at the timeline question, and then I'll let Nicholas answer the questions around the detailed DHC. So I do want to, again, stress that the notional timeline that we put out is around the data getting us to production for the demographic and housing characteristics file, the DHC, so that doesn't give you the detailed race and ethnicity, American and Alaska Native area, tribe data. However, we are in our discussions and planning phases working with Nicholas and his team around the development schedule for the detailed DHC. Unfortunately, we don't have any additional detail to give you around what the horizon looks in terms of when we would be releasing that data. Our focus has been on let's try to get the timeline together for DHC, and at the same time, Nicholas and his team are also continuing to do the development work for the detailed DHC. I will point out, however, that they are and we continue to ask for use cases to help us firm up these proposals for the detailed DHC. So while we don't and have not identified a timeline that says, hey, we need the comments by this date, we are still encouraging feedback now, which is why we did include those table proposals as part of the crosswalk file, because we do want to continue those discussions. So we have a dual path here, one for the DHC and one for the detailed DHC, recognizing that our demo comrades here are both working on both of those products, and they have a lot of work ahead of them, as we all do. But again, I just want to stress that the timeline that we've been really focusing on and can really see the horizon of trying to get these data out by 2022, and we have said that's our tentative schedule, that is around the DHC and not necessarily around the detailed DHC. But again, we do encourage any feedback that you have around the detailed DHC proposal. Hope that helped.
Thanks, Cynthia. That was very helpful. Karthik, thanks for your questions, and particularly I want to reemphasize what Cynthia said. We're looking for use cases for the detailed DHC. The proposal that we put forward for the 4 detailed tables, those are the basic characteristics coming out of the decennial census, with population counts, sex by age characteristics, family and household characteristics, and tenure. There's many more detailed characteristics and things like the ACS. But for the nature of the decennial census, which is a count of everyone, which are down to those small geographic levels, what are the use cases that the public programs, laws, policies have that require these data for detailed population groups at various levels of geography? So for your examples, that type of information, that type of feedback is going to be very informative to the Census Bureau as we consider what the public has told us, and we can make decisions on how to further balance the accuracy and the privacy to meet some of those particular requirements. With the emphasis on the detailed groups, the very detailed disaggregated groups in comparison to the more regional categories, that was a level of comparison or parameter setting that I talked about. Some groups may see that a detailed group is more important than a regional grouping. Others may think I need the regional grouping defined and I want that in case the detail is not available at a certain level of geography. So maybe South Asian, for example, is still going to be important at a lower geographic level if you can't produce Pakistani, Indian, Bengali, etc. But we also need use cases for that. Balancing parameters, balancing these different privacy settings. Your feedback, the public's feedback, is very critical to us to help make those decisions. So thank you all for thinking about this.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Nicholas. Could
Sure.
you clarify, and maybe can it be more easily found on a page where kind of people can submit their use cases? No, the Census website is chock and it's very complex, but I think making a kind of a page where it could be very easy for community members that may not be as expert on the website would be helpful.
Thanks. That's also important feedback about communication, which we know the NAC and the CSAC working group for differential privacy is giving us good suggestions, but I'll ask Cynthia to say a little plug about how people can easily provide feedback, and we can also follow up with this to the public. Cynthia?
Great, thank you. Yes, we do have it placed all over the website. We are redesigning our website, but if you don't remember anything else, 2020-@census.gov. That is the email address. And we can also make sure we get that to you. But it is on the web. We've released newsletters. We've pinpointed that 2020-email. We pretty much advertise it everywhere on every web page of where you could provide the feedback.
Thanks so much.
I want to, Nicholas, if you had something else real quick. Okay. With that, we wanted to thank Jason, Cynthia, Nicholas, and Tom for a great discussion. I just have two quick notes I want to make before I pass it back to Karen. One is we will be back on schedule following the breakouts. Just a reminder that the NAC members were going to be going through teams for the breakouts. And then the second thing is for those who haven't read the chat and haven't seen the news, congratulations to Dr. Rob Santos, who is I guess he has to still be sworn in, so it's not official yet, but the Senate did confirm him as the new director of the Census Bureau. So congratulations. We look forward to working with Dr. Santos. And with that, we're going to turn it back over to Karen.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks to our great presenters, great discussion, and we definitely look forward to continuing that. Well, at this time, we're going to take a break. And it's during this time that the NAC members will congregate amongst themselves to discuss and formulate recommendations. So this concludes the NAC Fall Virtual Meeting proceedings for Day 1. And I hope you all found today's presentations and discussion helpful. So tomorrow we will begin with a presentation on the 2020 Census quality metrics, and that will be followed by many other important topics. So the WebEx session and audio will now end, and the NAC will now have offline discussions on today's topics. James Tucker and Cherokee Bradley will lead the NAC discussion and formulation of recommendations. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your participation. That concludes today's call. You may disconnect at this time.